service to our public mission. We at the Federal Reserve will do everything we can to achieve our maximum employment and price stability goals. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You've acknowledged the Fed likely waited too long to raise rates when prices shot up in 2021. We can't make that mistake again, Mr. Chair, at the expense of workers. If the Fed waits until unemployment starts increasing, it may be too late to cut rates in time to save American jobs. Why shouldn't the Fed act now to prevent workers from losing their jobs rather than reacting after the fact?
So we're well aware of that risk, of course, and very conscious of avoiding it. And what we said is if what we expect and what we're seeing is continued strong growth, a strong labor market, and continuing progress in bringing inflation down, if that happens, if the economy evolves over that path, then we do think that the process of carefully removing the restrictive stance of policy can and will begin over the course of this year.
I mean, I know we've had this conversation publicly here or privately also that, working people are hit the hardest with inflation. They're also hit the hardest when companies try to cut costs with layoffs. This town too often seems to forget that maximum employment is part of the Fed's dual mandate. Let me ask you about bank supervision. Senator Scott mentioned that. Last year's bank failures illustrate the need for strong oversight. SVB grew too big, too fast. Fed supervision didn't react decisively enough. The Fed, in response, undertook an assessment of its supervisory process to identify and address gaps related to the speed, the force, the agility, if that's the right word, of its supervision. Explain what concrete steps the Federal Reserve's taken to strengthen supervision in any specific areas where work to make improvements is ongoing.
So this is a very broad area of work.
कल की जो NFP है उसमें गोल्ड गिरेगा ये भी मैं आपको बताता चलूं
and it's a
मजे
very
लूट लो
rule
भाई
book. And so there's been careful study and thought and a lot of listening to understand how we can meet
ये
these
आप
goals
लोगों
of
को
being-
बताया था ना कि
being
इस जगह
quicker
से
and
बाय
more
करें
effective,
JPY
basically is how I would say it. If you look at Silicon
अब
Valley
यार वो
Bank,
सुन रहा हूं मैं आप
we weren't
मुझे
quick
सुनने
enough
दो
and
मैं
we
लिख
weren't
रहा हूं
effective
चीजें
enough where we were in. And so we're working hard to develop a new rule book and another set of practices, which is still going to be evidence-based and fair, but it's going to involve earlier interventions and more effective ones. And I think this is work that's ongoing and will be for some time.
Thank you. The job of the Fed, of all public officials, is to serve the American people,
इसकी
not their
आवाज तो
stock
निकल ही नहीं रही
portfolios. We've
इस
seen
बावे की
abuses in this body. We've seen abuses at the Federal Reserve. I wrote to you last month asking the Fed to identify substantive penalties for board officials who violate the trading rules. Where is that in the process? And I expect these rules in place before the next monetary policy hearing in 6 months. Where is it?
We got our own Inspector General gave us 6 things to work on. I read the list from beginning to end, and the 6th one was what you said, and I just said we're going to do all of these. Let's get going. So we've done 5 of them, and
profit
we're
आप लोग
working on the
बेशक
6th.
And it'll
जहां
be
पे
finished within
बुक कर
6
सकते
months
हैं
when
बाय
you're
का
back.
I want to
थोड़ा
get it
बहुत
right. I
प्रॉफिट ले
certainly
सकते
hope
हो
so and expect so.
बाकी को ब्रेक इवन रख
Expect so
सकते
is
हो
a better answer than
झटका
most.
लगा सकता है नीचे की साइड
One last question. More and more, many companies use algorithms that combine competitors' price information to engage in what they call dynamic pricing or surge pricing. You know that corporate PR teams worked hard on this. Just another way for corporations to make it harder for consumers to seek out lower prices and to pad corporate profits. Are you concerned that the wide adoption
बावे का
of
गला ही
these
खराब है इसकी
price
आवाज ही नहीं निकल रही
gouging
मैं सोच रहा मेरे
strategies,
गला
these
खराब है
pricing
ये
schemes,
देखो
if
ये
you
जो बोल रहा है
will
ना
contribute to inflation?
ये बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट सवाल है
I
यार
think it
सुनने
works
दो
both ways. Let me say this, we're well aware of this trend and we're monitoring it. Remember that prices go down when there's no one in the store and they go up when there are a lot of people if you're doing dynamic pricing. Same thing with the ride companies. it works both ways. I don't know that it have implication for, for inflation. It would certainly have implications for consumers who need to be informed.
You think that this kind of surge pricing might lower prices
वो पंजाबी
overall?
वाला बटन बटी नहीं वैसे ही बोल रहा है
My understanding is that the idea is that in slow periods, prices actually go down, and in higher in busy periods they go up.
But these are sophisticated economists working for these big companies, and they're not going to do things to
वो कल
lower their
करेंगे ना यार
profits.
अभी थोड़ी करेंगे वो
I
कल का
think the
कल
price
के लिए मैं
mechanism
प्रॉपर
is
वीडियो बनाऊंगा
incredibly
आपके लिए
important
फिकर
in
नहीं
our
करो
economy. I think
कल एनएफपी जो है ना वो
we need to give
हमेशा
companies the
पॉजिटिव आती
freedom
है
to do that as long as they're not fixing prices or failing to disclose the nature of the price changes to the public.
I have a few seconds. Research has indicated constrained supply was behind a significant amount of the inflation we've seen over the last few years. If the supply chain, for instance, of autos had been more resilient, or if there had been more housing availability, would that have made your job easier?
Yes, in a word. Yeah, a big part of the inflation was, and we saw it in 2023, when the supply chain problems unwound and when the labor supply shock that we had unwound as well, we saw inflation come down very quickly in the second half of the year. But it's also down to, tight monetary policies playing a role as well.
Which leads me to the plea with you to speak out about inflation, about the contribution of corporate profits and greed to inflation. Thank you.
Oh, I know you are done. That's true. Well, I was
Find yourself agreeing with me more and more often? Is that what?
that would be a nightmare, and I'm awake.
also
So, what I would say, however, is that the fact of the matter is that so often, if in fact 60%, I actually listened to what you said, which was remarkable.
अच्छा अपडेट बताता चलो यार कि गोल्ड जो है ना थोड़ा सा पीछे की तरफ आ सकता है ये स्पाइक आपको मिल गया प्रॉफिट बुक कर लें थोड़ा सा 50% रख लें इसको ब्रेक इवन करें और नीचे फिर अपॉर्चुनिटी देखें वैसे माशाल्लाह 70 पिप्स 80 पिप्स मिल गए जो मैंने आपको बोला था दोनों लेवल चल गए अभी ये तो काफी टाइम बोलते रहेंगे ना
happens for every homeowner in the country. So I think the issue is far more complicated and would love to delve into that over the next 4 minutes and 18 seconds. But my first question is a combination between the challenges of illegal immigration and crime. It seems like every single week there's another story of another city underwater attempting to feed and house millions of illegal immigrants, and American taxpayers are footing that bill. Like I mentioned in my opening statement, just recently in Denver, we saw city workers having their hours essentially zeroed out so that the city could allocate more resources for the illegal immigrants. In San Francisco, they say that the average cost between San Francisco and Oakland, because of crime, is almost $4 billion. Couple that with in New York, you see Governor Hochul bringing out the National Guard and the state police to help reduce the impact of crime. At the same time, Mayor Adams says he needs more money because the state of affairs from illegal immigrants in the city is devastating the economy, scaring the citizens, and reducing the opportunity for business as usual to return to New York City. So my question is, can you explain how our economy is expected to continue shouldering the burden and the costs because of illegal immigration? And what, if any, information do you have as it relates to the impact of this surge of crime in our major cities?
एनएफटी में नीचे जा सकता है ये सही बोला है 2120
because I heard the discussion that when you have more folks in the store, you have more shoppers. Except for these days, when you have more folks in the store, sometimes they're just there to steal.
So you quoted my statement earlier, and it was an accurate quote, for which I thank you. But I would say right before that, what I said was immigration policy, very important, very much under discussion, and it's none of our business. We don't set immigration policy, and we don't comment on it. So,
But you commented on immigration, so
Euro
my point
USD
though
का
is that
profit
when
book
you're
कर लें
going to
आप,
tell a story, please tell
क्योंकि
the
ये
whole story,
resistance है,
especially when the
गिर
nation
सकता है दोबारा.
is frustrated by nearly 10 million folks by the end of this year coming into the country and having the kind of negative impact on prices, on crime,
ये मैंने
on the
आपको live
challenges
बोला
that
था कि
everyday
इस area से
Americans,
buy कर रहा हूं.
especially Americans living in the
56 के area
poorest
से,
parts of
के आसपास.
America face on a daily basis.
ये मेरी buy लगी थी.
So, as you accurately quoted, I was referring, I said over time, so I
Yes,
was
sir.
referring to the history, which with you agreed, so
अच्छा,
I
gold की
wasn't, I was
update.
staying as far as I
Gold
possibly
अभी
could
उधर ही है,
from the
कहीं नहीं
current
गया भाई.
political
इसको break even
context.
किया
And,
हुआ है.
you
कुछ
know,
profit
it's
हमने
really not
57 पे
appropriate
book
for
कर
us.
लिया.
We're independent,
आधा
we
पीछे
like to
रख लिया
remain that way.
48 के
And the
आसपास.
way we do that, one
वापस
of the
आएगा
ways
तो
is by
0 पे
staying
कटेगा.
out of political issues that we
50 से
really
फिर हम
aren't
51 से
assigned.
फिर buy
And,
देखेंगे. लेकिन अभी वो
so
बोल
the
रहे हैं ना,
kinds of
जब
issues
अभी
you're talking
बोलेंगे
about
तो
are
गोल्ड
very,
थोड़ा
very
नीचे तो
real. I
जाना
don't
चाहिए.
deny
मेरे
that, but
नजदीक
they're
तो
really not for
इसको
us.
2141
So the
तक
Fed
जाना
does
चाहिए.
not consider the impact of 10 million illegal immigrants coming to our
थोड़ा सा मुझे
country and
सुनने
the
दें,
costs
मैं
associated
पढ़ता
with
हूँ.
those illegal immigrants, nor do they consider the impact on states like New York or California or Illinois, where the devastation of crime ravaging the poorest Americans has an impact. We don't take that into consideration.
So, you know, we do, and so does the Congressional Budget Office, we do try to estimate population, and we try to estimate the effect of immigration, legal or illegal, on the size of the workforce and on GDP. If you look at the Congressional Budget Office has, as you probably know, a detailed assessment of all the things like that. We don't really have a way, and we do look at the finances in the aggregate of state and local governments, that's in the hiring that they do. So that's something we look at, but we wouldn't do a very specific assessment like that. I mean, CBO would, but we wouldn't do that.
Thank you.
Scott, Senator Menendez of New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
इसका गला
Before I
पहले ठीक
begin my
कराओ यार.
questions, I want to celebrate that in the past year, we have seen the
कैसे?
first Latino Federal Reserve governor and the first ever Latino Federal Reserve Bank president. These are historic milestones that show we are finally making progress, something that I have been at for quite some time, to the leadership
कहाँ से
of
आपने hedge किया हुआ
our
है? hedge
economic institutions. So I want to applaud that.
निकल जाएगी
And,
buy,
Mr.
लेकिन आपने
Chairman,
बड़ी
I hope that
गलत
progress
जगह
can
पे buy
continue and
लगाई है.
extend to the rest
वहाँ से तो
of
buy
the
दी
Federal
नहीं है.
Reserve
54
staff.
और 51 से
I
बोला
agree
था.
with my friend, the ranking member, that when you tell a story, you should tell the whole story. Mr. Chairman, are you aware of the Washington Post February 27th article that says the economy is roaring and immigration is a key reason?
I don't recall that, but I would have read it.
Let me read it to you. Immigration has propelled the U.S. job market further than just about anyone expected, helping cement the country's economic rebound from the pandemic as the most robust in the world. It goes on to say, economists and labor experts say the surge in employment was ultimately key to solving unprecedented gaps in the economy that threatened the country's ability to recover from prolonged shutdowns.
थोड़ा इसको सुनने देना फिर
Would
देखते
you
हैं.
take issue with those statements?
You know, there are a lot of adjectives and adverbs in there that you wouldn't see in Fed world, but the
Take out the adjectives and give me on the
yeah,
substance.
the story is, I think broadly, it is that there was a very significant increase in the size of the workforce last year, and it was happening all during the year, and we were wondering what it was, and the answer was it was really two things. It was labor force participation, but it was also immigration. And if you look at the Congressional Budget Office numbers, it kind of makes sense because there was a lot of growth. Wages were coming down. The economy is bigger. And those are probably in part affected. This is without making any judgments on immigration or immigration policy, but I think that's an economic fact.
I'm not suggesting that. I'm just suggesting the facts are
Yep.
that we had 10 or 11 million jobs that were going unfulfilled in our economy. They lacked the productivity that is necessary for success economically. And as part of that, clearly, immigration helped fuel part of our revival coming out of the pandemic. In fact, those were the people who were the essential workers when the rest of us were staying home. So I agree we need to do what is necessary to have a regularized border, but I also think that just to create the context of immigration as a scourge is absolutely wrong. Let me turn to another question. In my view, the sticky inflation we've been seeing in the housing sector is principally due to the massive nationwide housing shortage. The Fed's monetary policy report attributes the shortage to restrictive zoning, high interest rates, and tighter underwriting by banks. I would also add to that list underfunding of key HUD programs that shore up and expand our supply of
51 से
affordable
सेल
housing.
किए आ जाएगी
If the
मार्केट
housing supply shortage
51 के ऊपर अभी
continues to
आने
grow,
वाली।
are we likely to see continued housing inflation?
Yes, we are.
And housing is already becoming less and less affordable for low and middle-income Americans. According to the National Low-Income Housing Coalition's 2023 Out-of-Reach report, a worker earning the minimum wage in New Jersey would have to work 2 full-time jobs to afford a modest one-bedroom rental home at fair market rent. Do you agree that increasingly unaffordable housing is a problem for the economy?
I think there are two things going on. One is a longer-term housing shortage, and the other is the pandemic effects and the associated higher interest rates, which are things that will pass through. When all that passes through and rates are normalized, we'll still have the underlying housing shortage, and it's going to be causing upward pressure on housing prices.
Now, the monetary policy report noted that, quote, home purchases by low-income households have fallen disproportionately more because mortgage lenders impose maximums on the ratio of a borrower's debt service payments to the borrower's income. I'm worried about how this dynamic will interact with the recently proposed capital requirements proposal, which, according to analysis from the Urban Institute, would disproportionately increase the cost of mortgages for Black, Hispanic, and low- and income moderate borrowers. Given this, isn't there a risk that if the capital rules implemented without changes, that it could make it even harder for disadvantaged borrowers to attain home ownership?
There is a risk like that, and we're very focused on it.
And hopefully you're working to mitigate it.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Chairman. Senator Rounds from South Dakota.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Powell, welcome back. Look, first of all, I've appreciated the way that you've approached the discussions in front of this committee, and I understand your desire to stay as neutral as possible with regard to the politics involved in an
पॉसिबल
election
है
year.
एक मिनट रुको
But I do have some questions
थोड़ा
here
सुन लो चीजें
specifically
सुन
with
लो यार
regard to
ट्रेड
the
होती
Basel
रहेगी ना
III endgame
कुछ चीजें भी तो
proposal.
समझ आए
An analysis of that proposal found that 97% were either opposing it or expressing substantial concerns. In the hearing last March on the monetary policy report, you stated that the Federal Reserve is a consensus organization, and you said, and I quote, I will do everything I can possibly to bring people together in consensus and have a capital framework that could be broadly supported. My question to that is, do you currently believe that there is a consensus on this capital framework?
I believe that we will have one. I'm fairly confident that we will have such a consensus when we do move forward.
So we could expect that you will probably not call a vote on the proposal until you believe that there is a consensus?
I think that's right. I mean, we're just in the process
बाइक
of
किया हुआ है खैर है होल्ड करें उधर क्या
digesting the
मार्केट कहाँ
comments
जाना
and then making
अभी
the
55 पे
appropriate
आ जाइए
changes.
सब्र कर
Thank you. As you are aware, I've weighed in several times on the concerns that I have with regard to Basel III endgame, including
जी जी
I'm
ऊपर
concerned
जाइए
about
ऊपर
the
जाइए
lack of
टेंशन ना लो
transparency,
सब्र करो
the negative effects on mortgage lending and home affordability by disincentivizing banks from offering high loan-to-value loans that primarily help first-time home buyers and low to moderate income borrowers. I'm concerned that the proposal will make buying a home harder than it already is for many. And further down the road, I fear that it could disincentivize mortgage lending from the largest banks, particularly with regard to the secondary market and their impact on even smaller banks that do business with them. Would you be willing to withdraw the proposal or re-propose with significant modifications, particularly addressing the concerns that I and others have on this committee, raising specifically with regard to the impact? And I'm thinking of Freddie and Fannie in particular and what the impact might be. What would you see as the process involving those particular issues?
So on those issues, we're well aware of and very focused on those issues. We haven't decided what to do about that yet, but we get it on those issues. In terms of process, we're not at the stage of making that decision. I will say, if it turns out to be appropriate, when we get to that point, for us to repropose parts or all of the thing, then we won't hesitate to
H1
do
के ऊपर
so.
ना बेरिश इनकम
Thank you. Makes me feel a little bit better because I do think there are some very serious problems that would occur if the Basel III Endgame as proposed goes into effect. And I most certainly am hoping that the Federal Reserve will find a consensus on this. And it sounds like that may very well include some significant modifications if it were to be brought at all. Is that a fair statement?
I expect there will be material and broad changes to the proposal before it comes back to the committee for consideration, the board for consideration.
Thank you, sir. Let's just, with regard to the economy today, a limited level of price growth is believed to help facilitate economic expansion, reduce the risk of recession, and help businesses and consumers plan. However, during the Biden administration, we saw inflation climb to 13%, and those prices are now the new norm. I know that you make it a policy not to comment on the administration's fiscal policy, but it is well known that I really do believe that high inflation and high prices have been a direct result of President Biden's policies, failed in many cases, that the Federal Reserve has limited tools to address some of the problems that these policies created.
ये M15
We
के
talk
ऊपर भी
about
बेरिश
supply
बनी है, ये
side versus
retest हो गई,
demand side
इस
on
area
these
तक possible
costs.
आए.
What have been some of the unintended consequences from raising
Seller
the
पहले से
federal
फंसे हुए
funds
हैं,
rate
कितना
as
फंसे हैं?
rapidly as you felt that you had to as the chair and as the committee? What are some of those? I know that we talked a little bit about SVP and the failure there, their inability to look at treasuries and the increasing interest rates and so forth. But can you talk a little bit about some of the things that you've seen that were negative with regard to trying to respond to those high inflation rates?
Yes. So high interest rates are hard for businesses. They're hard for people. They're the thing they're the tool that we have to use to bring inflation down. And our job at this time, when high
इस टाइम
inflation
न्यूज़ टाइम पे engulfing नहीं
comes,
काम
it is the
करती.
Fed's job
पहले ही
to
बताया
restore
हुआ है,
price
छोड़ दें.
stability, and that's what we're doing. You point to the losses
Level
of
zoom
banks.
काम करते हैं.
That was a very substantial thing, and obviously the supervisors, and that was us, didn't get to that problem. We were aware of it, but we didn't probably appreciate it enough. Another surprise, though,
तीन दिन से किधर
is that
फंसा
we
रहे हैं,
were
पूरे
able to get this far
एक
and
हफ्ते
get
से फंसा
inflation
रहे हैं
down
seller को.
this quickly without seeing a big increase in unemployment. And that's just a great result. That's just a surprise. It's not consistent with the historical record, but it's a really positive thing.
Thank you. And I would just know that the only tools you had available were demand-side tools.
Yeah, that's right.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Senator Warner of Virginia is recognized.
तो ये
Thank you,
थोड़ा
Mr.
बंदा
Chairman.
रखा है.
Chairman Powell, it's great to see you. I would point out to my good friend from South Dakota,
अंदर चले गए.
I do think, if we'd gone back a year to 18 months ago, nobody would have predicted
कल
a
के दिन
soft
तो
landing.
चांस है गोल्ड के
And
बेरिश
I
होने
know
के
you're not ready to
एनएफपी
declare
में
victory by any means, but the fact that
ये जो है ना, कल
inflation has come down, and I actually think some of the things, like the CHIPS bill, the infrastructure bill, and some of President Biden's policies have actually kept the economy growth rate at the levels that have allowed you to bring down inflation
Well, both
without seeing
important
a
update,
dramatic
yeah.
rise in unemployment. And
कल ये
again,
सारी
that'll
न्यूज़
be something
पॉजिटिव
we'll
करें,
probably
रेट्स
have the
इंक्रीज
opportunity
करें.
to litigate over the next 8 or 9 months.
ये रेट
I wanna
अनएम्प्लॉयमेंट रेट कम
take my
करेंगे इस
time on
परसेंटेज से.
issues around
तो
less
अगर
about
कम
monetary
करें तो
policy
फिर
and more about
DXY ग्रो करेगा.
regulation. I think you can never presume that we're out of the woods on financial stability, as we saw with the New York Community Bank yesterday, the stock plunge and
बाबा ही चला गया,
the
क्यों
capital infusion.
नाराज
One
हो
area that I raised with you a year ago, I want to re-raise today, and that is non-bank lending. The fact that non-bank lending in terms of to
बाबे से
non-financial
बात-
firms
पहले
now
पता
is
चल जाए
actually
कि आप कहने वाले.
exceeding regulated bank lending. And let me be clear, I've got, the non-bank financial sector has done productive things in our society over the years. But when folks like former Fed President Dudley and former Fed Governor Grosvenor recently said that they had worries about this
इसकी
reliance
आवाज
on
भी
the
डॉलर का
non-bank
बैठा
financial
बताया हुआ है.
sector could lead to overall
सही
economic
कह रहे
lack of
हैं.
stability. I guess, what do
होल्ड
you
करें ना
think?
यार, क्यों काटते?
I've got a
ब्रेक इवन
three-part
करें.
question. What do you think are the
बाहर रहने
risks
दें,
as we
कुछ
see
नहीं
this
होता.
push-out effect of
हाँ,
of
57
more and
के ऊपर
more
आधा profit
lending
book
going
किया था पहले, आप
outside
भी
the
आधा करें.
regulated perimeter to the non-bank sector? how much do we really know about these institutions? And one of the things they have
चाचा पॉल के
very
सामने
smart,
ये सारे
sophisticated
गाने गा रहे हैं ना,
investors.
वो
But
सुन
those
रहे
very
हैं, सवाल
smart,
कर रहे हैं।
sophisticated investors said, well, hey, we don't like the lending profile right now, and we want you to not make any additional
सब बाबा
loans
जन्म
for the
मशवरे
next
भी
6
दे
to
रहे हैं।
9 months. Do you think our system would be able to pick up the slack?
So we have the regulated banking system where you've got a lot of transparency, you've got deposit insurance, you've got access to, the discount window and all those things, regulation. If you go outside that, most of the funding that we see now in these vehicles is sophisticated investors who are actually limited partners, meaning they can't pull their money out. They've signed a contract, they've funded these deals. And so what you see now in the non-bank financial sector is significantly, it's that kind of thing. So
अभी तो
it
चांस
doesn't
नहीं
have
लग
the
रहे
run
इस टाइम
risk.
सेल के ना।
The point is, the bigger
करें।
it grows and the more diverse it gets, it is happening outside the regulatory perimeter. And you worry that when there is another crisis, you'll be surprised, but there will be ways that financial structure too can break down, and it does break down in ways we don't anticipate. So I think we need to be smart about the way, about intermediation is absolutely moving out of the banks into the capital markets and into non-bank financial institutions. That's what's been happening for a long,
ये
long
बाबा
time.
खुद रुला हुआ है
I
इस
just think
टाइम
we need to be
जितनी
thoughtful
इनकी DX
about
हुई,
understanding where the risks are emerging.
And that sophisticated investor may rightfully say, hey, we don't want you to lend anymore for a X period of time, but that may then
हाँ
at
सेल बुक
that
कर ले यार
moment of
2165
crisis
से जो सेल है
mean
उसका
that the
वैसे
lending capability is
60 उसका
completely
सेल
dry up.
रख
And
लो
one of the
वैसे
things I
बुक कर
never
लो ज्यादा
completely
बेहतर है
understood until I got a
लेकिन अगर
little better
मजीद आप
explanation recently,
बढ़ाना
why
चाहते
the
हो उसका
large
सर्विस
regulated banks weren't more complaining about this non-bank lending. But as I got to understand a little bit more of the, and again, I'm not per se criticizing on the non-bank lending, but many of the regulated banks actually lend to these large institutions, so they make, they make money off of those relationships, and maybe that's again an explanation of why they're not being more critical. I only got 40 seconds left, but I would like to come back to another thing that we've talked about a lot, and that is the question of use of the discount window. I believe one of the original tools that the Fed had. I know banks say, well, we're concerned about the stigma. I've got some legislation that would actually require mandatory use of the discount window. I'd love your comment on that. And also just the idea that having the mechanics of the discount window open, potentially even 24/7, because we saw with SVB, they didn't know how to use it, but two, if they wanted to use it in the non-bank hours, could they get access?
There's a lot of work to do on the discount window. You're absolutely right. It needs to be brought up technologically into the modern age. We need to do more to eliminate the stigma problem, and we need to make sure that banks are, actually able to use it when they need to use it. And those things, that's a broad work program that we're on right now, and it's very important.
I know you're working on it, but I would look forward to working more, and I'd invite other
बहुत
colleagues.
crash
I
है
really
यार।
do think before we start adding a whole host of the other regulatory issues, we ought to use some of the tools that are out there. You're not gone, so.
God, I just checked in at the Veterans Committee. Senator Tillis, North Carolina. Thank you, Mark.
I was about to take control, Senator Warner. Welcome, Chair Powell, and Gus sends his regards. If you have time after the hearing, you ought to go by and see him. He's a dog in our office. But
I don't want to disturb his nap, but
but thank you for being here. I want to get back on this Basel III proposal. Senators Lummis, Coons, Gillibrand, and I sent a letter indicating our concerns with the current proposal. But I think it's also worth noting that the number of other organizations, a diverse group that are not normally aligned on policy. You got Bank Trades, National Housing Conference, NAACP, Habitat for Humanity, National Community Reinvestment Coalition, the list goes on, who have concerns with the current proposal. Here's my concern. I think we're trying to make the best of what was foundationally a bad proposal. And so I'm in the category of people who think that it should be reproposed, because I think one of the reasons why I did not
गोल्ड यहाँ से बाय
support
किया मैंने और कितना
Mr.
बाय
Barr's
करना है बार-बार बाय
nomination is I
करोगे
felt like we were going to be here. I mean, it was
Bearish
pretty
engulfing
clear
इस
to
टाइम कोई नहीं
me
चलेगी
before
engulfing
he
छोड़
ever
दें
got confirmed
न्यूज़
on
टाइम पे
the
नहीं
board
चलती
that we were going to be in this place some months or years later. And here we are. And I think that the industry felt the same way. All of these stakeholders, some of them are in banking trade, some of them are on the other side of the
2153 से सेल क्यों
spectrum.
किया?
So I'd like to cast my vote
सेल की इतवाक नहीं
or
बनती
provide some weight
इधर से।
to the idea that we should repropose it. And what we ought to do is talk about the reality of increasing capital, or the prospect of increasing capital requirements doesn't concern me. I think the prior
Powell तो जाहिर बात है वो हमेशा
supervisor
डॉलर को
had
डिफेंड
made
करता है भाई।
comments publicly that maybe we needed to raise capital standards. But what we did here in this proposal, and I heard in that dialogue, is let's deal with puts and takes. Let's talk about raising capital requirements, but let's also talk about reducing the cost of the regulatory burden today if we can do it responsibly. There's no evidence of that in the current proposal, and I think that may actually produce a different set of comments that would be instructive to a final proposal that I think realistically will include some increase in capital requirements. So over what time horizon do you think we would expect to either try to make the best of this foundation or go back and take a look at a new foundation and repropose it?
You know, we're going to work through it as quickly as we can and should. I will say it's more important to get it right than it is to do it fast. We're not in a hurry. But my guess is we'll work this out over the course of this year.
Yeah. Well, if you take a look at the outsized cost of operational risk, the long list of concerns that I have publicly and privately expressed on the current proposal, I do think sometimes it's easier to knock down what I think is a poor foundation and build a better house. So again, just wanted to make that comment publicly. I got a question about shrinkflation. I tell you,
GBP
some of these
JPY
words
buy में
that we
चला
come
गया
up
ना,
with,
अभी
but,
उसका
President
profit हो गया
Biden's
होगा
using the
फिर
idea of shrinkflation and chastising manufacturers for creating smaller portion sizes for
Profit में
potato chips.
चल
I'll use that as one example. But
इधर से buy बोल के गया था पिछली
if
लाइफ
you
में
have
आपको।
rising input cost, and you're not able to control that, and you're in a marginal business to begin with, and now you're saying you can't even reduce the quantities, how does a business that's not making a profit make that work?
You know, I mean, we see inflation at the aggregate level as a mismatch between supply and demand.
Yeah.
And as we've seen supply get better and we've seen demand cool off a bit, it was very hot coming out of
अभी
the
के live
pandemic.
zone
We see
में
inflation
mention
coming
किए
down.
हैं
We saw
देखो तो
food
सही।
inflation, or we saw food inflation between 2010, 2021 at 18% over 11 years. And over the last 3 years, we've seen it at 21%. I think that we have a industry that's trying to actually provide products that consumers want, and now they're being chastised for trying to figure out how to make the numbers work. So this whole
वालेकुम
idea
सलाम
of
रिजवान भाई कैसे हैं आप
shrinkflation is
ठीक
just
हैं?
confounding to me. I'm going to submit some for the record. I want to stay on time. But I have a question. I
अच्छा
think
किया
the
है,
chair
आपने trade नहीं की, बहुत
mentioned,
अच्छा किया है।
and
अभी
if I misunderstood
जाके
this,
जो है
I'm
ना
sure the chair
वो
will clarify. But I
reversal
thought
पे
in his
trade
opening
लेना सर
comments, he suggested that stock buybacks and paying out dividends were a key factor in inflation. Do you, as just a matter of policy, see stock buybacks and dividends as one of the top 5 reasons we're experiencing the inflation we have right now?
बबलू थैंक यू वेरी मच।
First, I guess I see stock buybacks and dividends as just the same thing in a different form. And
ये बहुत
I
अच्छा
have
move हो
I
गया है।
wouldn't comment on anything the chair even may have said.
ये भी
Well,
गोल्ड की तरफ जब भी
I'd
नीचे
like to
आए
avoid that.
I don't think, I'm not going to ask you about
वास्तव में
policy
क्यों
because I
झगड़े कर
think
रहे हो?
you're consistent on that, but I just can't imagine that if we decided to outlaw stock buybacks and dividend payments, that would have a material effect
71
on
बिलाल साहब
inflation. So
76 तक
I'm not going to
स्पाइक
ask
ये
you to
लगाने
respond to that, but
एनएफपी
there
से
are some
पहले
people
कोशिश
that
करेंगे
by
ऊपर
inference you can
दौड़ा
assume
लगवाने की
that
देखो फिर
they think that would be helpful. I just, for one, I'm not an economist, but I just can't imagine that it would be,
जी
one of the things that would make your
जाएगा,
job
क्या माफ
easier.
कीजिए।
Can you
बिल्कुल
at least
जाएगा, क्यों नहीं
opine on
जाएगा?
that?
उससे भी नीचे जाएगा,
Banning
1960
stock
भी
buybacks
जाएगा।
and dividends?
लेकिन अभी
I
नहीं
think
ना,
that would be
समर
quite a
सीजन
change
में
in our
ड्रॉप
capital
होना शुरू
markets.
होगा। अभी आप
Me too.
I mean, shareholders,
नए हाई
this is
मारेंगे।
just money going back to shareholders from
Me
companies
too.
that have
जरूर
nothing to
करेंगे
do with it.
इंशाल्लाह।
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair.
सर बीटीसी को सेल कर सकते हैं।
Senator Smith of Minnesota is
स्माइल देखो
recognized.
इसकी
Thank you,
खाली।
Mr. Chair. And thank you, Chair Powell. It's great to see you here again. I appreciate your testimony. And I'm going to focus my questions on housing and housing affordability. As you have
ये बहुत
well
important
pointed
सवाल
out,
कर रही है,
overall
सुनिए।
prices have moderated considerably since the Fed began raising rates, yet housing costs have remained stubbornly resilient or high, leaving us really no closer to addressing the affordability crisis that I think that we have, and this was there well before the pandemic. Shortly before the Fed began tightening, Chair Powell, and you came before the committee, I asked you about how higher interest rates could exacerbate this unaffordability problem that we have by making mortgages more expensive and also hindering housing
बड़ा time
development. And I
frame
think that
एक
at the
एक मिनट
time you
रुको यार,
argued that we
बहुत
have
important सवाल है, मैं करता
excess
हूँ
housing demand during the pandemic, and that was kind of at the root of higher costs, and that your goal, the Fed's goal, was to bring demand closer in line with supply. So my first question is this. So the housing market has cooled significantly over the last 2 years. Is it your view that it has cooled enough so that housing supply and demand is better in balance? And following on that, given the Fed's limited tools, understanding that, at what point will you think that you've done all that you can to lower housing demand?
इसका भी मैंने बाय दिया था।
My view is that we're well past
दिखाता
time
हूँ।
in Congress to take action on the housing supply side, but I'm interested in how you see this dynamic.
So we're not focused so much on housing and housing
ईटी कर
inflation.
गए।
We're really focused on the aggregate, which is also
Yep.
goods and non-housing services. That's way more than half of the PCE inflation. There are things in the housing sector that we didn't fully anticipate. One of them just was that people in very low interest rate homes with very low interest rate mortgages aren't selling.
ये
So
91
the
ईट कर
quantity
गया
of
यार,
homes that's
91
available
TP
is
रखा हुआ था।
incredibly low, and that's why
पहले हो
there's
गया।
very little in the way of existing home sales, and that drives up existing home sale prices, but also new home sale prices. So
हो गया। इसका वॉल्यूम ही बंद हो। अच्छा जी, गोल्ड मार्केट
Minnesota is that higher interest
Yeah,
rates are,
yeah.
of course, driving up the cost of construction. They're driving up the cost of mortgage rates. You're seeing people who aren't leaving a house that maybe is a little too small for them because they can't afford it, that the housing, just as you're saying, people are staying in their homes longer. And so there's sort of this double whammy of construction slowing at the same time that there is this great need to address housing supply. One of the things that is happening, it's interesting, a recent analysis by Zillow found that the monthly mortgage payment let me get this right. A recent analysis by Zillow found that the monthly mortgage payment on a home, on a $343,000 home, assuming 10% down payment, is about $2,200 a month. Okay, so $2,200 a month. That means the cost of owning a typical home is higher than 30% of median income, which is kind of the measure of affordability. And so we've got a lot of issues with people just being priced out of the housing market. So from where I sit, the
ये $4
cumulative
बचे ना
issues of
$4
higher
को रहने दे यार।
mortgage rates are just really a challenge, and until we can get to the bottom of that, we're going to have a hard time addressing the housing affordability challenge.
48 से बाय में
Would you
है
like to
की हुई है
comment
ना,
on that?
ऑलरेडी बाय की हुई है।
yes, I
और
I
पिछली
agree with
लाइव में
all
मैं
that.
बता के गया था कि
we don't
लाइव
actually,
बाय
home
करो।
prices don't actually go into the calculation of inflation. It's really rents and
Right.
owner's equivalent rent. But
Kind of like
I agree, the
this.
housing market is in a very, very difficult situation. And, the sooner we can get back to
इसके
price
$4 बच
stability
गए ना
and
यार, वाश तो नहीं
restore
हुआ।
interest rates to lower levels, the
अच्छा
sooner it can
एक
start
मिनट दे दें
healing.
यार, इनकी ऑक्सीजन वाली
Thank you.
बात
Thank you,
बड़ी
Mr. Chair.
important थी।
Thank you, Senator Smith. Senator Kennedy of Louisiana is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for being here. Thank you for your services. I think I've said before, I believe you and your team probably saved the world economy during the pandemic economic meltdown when the whole world wanted dollars by establishing the currency swap line. So I thank you for that. You gave an interview Mr. Chairman, on February 4th of this year to CBS, 60 Minutes, I think. Is that right?
Yep.
I ordered a transcript of that hearing, which I read. I learned a lot reading it. You were asked a question about inflation.
जी उधर
And
जाए तो देखेंगे
you asked a
चांस नहीं लग रहा
question about prices declining.
अब
And here
सीपी से
was
पहले
your
देखेंगे या
response.
फिर
I'd like to
41 के
quote
एरिया से
you, if it's okay.
अगर नीचे आया
Quote, so the prices of some things will decline, others will go up. But we don't expect to see a decline in the overall price level. That doesn't tend to happen in economies except in very negative circumstances. End quote. Did I quote you accurately?
I believe you did.
Okay. Later in the interview, you were asked about the national debt. Do you recall that?
I don't actually, but I'm sure that's right.
Okay. Well, at least according to the transcript, your answer was, and again, I'm quoting you, in the long run, the United States is on an unsustainable fiscal path.
मुझे लग
The
रहा है
U.S.
कल
federal
मार्केट
government's
इस
on
साइड
an
इस जगह पे आ सकती है
unsustainable fiscal path. And that just means that the debt is growing faster than the economy. So it is unsustainable. End quote.
अगर ये कैंडल इसके नीचे जाके
remember
क्लोज
saying
होती
that?
है
I've said that many times. I
तो
think
फिर
that's
कल एनएफपी में मार्केट
uncontroversial.
जो है ना वो इस एरिया तक आ सकती है
Later in the interview, you said, I'm going to quote, you know, I would just say this, integrity is priceless. And at the end, that's all you have. And we plan on keeping ours, end quote. Is that an accurate statement?
Yes, it is.
Okay. That's why I want to ask you about the FDIC. Have you read the article in the Wall Street Journal entitled, quote, Strip clubs, lewd photos, and a boozy hotel, the toxic atmosphere at bank regulator FDIC, end
नहीं
quote.
2065 तो नहीं
I think
जाएगा
I did read
मुनीश
that a couple
लेकिन
months ago.
2120 तक
Did
जाने
you
की
read the
तवक्को है
article
कल
entitled, I quote again, FDIC lawyer stayed on paid leave for weeks after child porn arrest, end quote.
I don't remember that one.
Okay, did you read the article entitled, also in the Wall Street Journal, quote, FDIC chair, known for temper, ignored bad behavior in workplace.
बस
end
आपने
quote.
अच्छा एवरेज किया हुआ है अपना कुको
Honestly, I don't. I read so much.
Wait
you know,
करें
I
थोड़ा सा
can't. I remember the broad story, but not particular stories.
Did you read the article in which a former female
हाँ, long term के लिए
employee
अच्छी
of the
इनकी-
FDIC allegedly recalled her male colleagues saying women needed to use sex to get ahead at the FDIC?
I do not recall that. No.
Okay.
Tarak.
Did you read the article in which a female risk management examiner during
बाबू को
lunch
कब्रों के साइज देखने
with
चाहिए
a
इधर आके
male
अपना डिवीजन दे रहे हैं
examiner said she had become friendly with that examiner, and he complained to her about his marriage, allegedly, telling
बाबा
her
थोड़ा
he
confidence है
wasn't
उसको
getting
कल
enough
बहुत कंफ्यूज
sex.
था
And she
आज
allegedly
confidence है
said,
इसको
quote, obviously if I walked,
आज तैयारी
or
करके
he
आ रटे मार के
allegedly said, obviously if I walked into this office and you were naked, I'd fuck you right here, end quote.
I do not remember that, and I think I would.
Okay. Do you remember the article about Mr. Randall Ditch,
कोई
the
बात नहीं 96
supervisory examiner
डबल
in
96
Denver,
से रिसीव करेंगे
who
markets, tension
allegedly
नहीं है।
was demoted in 2014 to a
यार आप लोग सीपी ट्रेड किया करो जो सीपी बताया
examiner
करो प्लीज उससे
position
ऊपर
in-
आप लोग बाय
in,
रखा करें
Tulsa
उससे
after
नीचे
having
एसएल किया
sex
करें
twice
सॉरी
with a
उसके लिए
subordinate
आज तो मैंने
female
आपको
employee
सीपी से प्रॉपर
and
ट्रेड
a
दी
number
थी
of other
अगर
rule
आपने वीडियो आज देखी है
violations. In this article, it says
दिखाता हूँ।
allegedly Mr. Ditch had urged the woman to not, quote, be a pussy,
ये-
close quote, and drink a shot of whiskey during
आज की
work
बाई का जो
hours, the
एसएल
records
था ना वो
show.
2144 था
Do you
2144
I do not
हुआ नहीं
recollect
है
that.
और कितनी
Here's
दफा
my
आपको बाय दी
question.
है
I could go on for a while.
Could go on, but you're not going to go on, so you've
Okay,
passed your
Brad.
5 minutes. Do your question once.
Sir?
Senator Kennedy, your time's already expired. You can do one, You did 5 minutes.
उसको कहता है
consumed
तुम्हारा
all
टाइम ही
5
खत्म
minutes
हो गया,
with
तू नहीं
your
पूछ सकता सवाल।
monologue of,
Well, you did 6 minutes.
6 मिनट है
time?
तुम्हारे पास, पूछ जो पूछ रहे हैं।
I asked my,
You did 6 minutes.
Senator Kennedy, for months, I have let you go way over the 5 minutes. You get your question,
But you did 6 minutes.
I chair this committee.
I understand. You still did 6 minutes. Check the record.
I'm going to order, you're going to be. at
कुछ भी
6
जहाँ
minutes
पर
and
6 मिनट
15
पूरे
seconds to
जाया करेगा।
continue this argument,
Well,
or
that's-
you're going to ask your question.
I'll ask my question. I just wanted the record to be clear, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, in light of these allegations,
H4 था, H4 जो अभी बनाया है।
how can the FDIC lead this charge
ये H4 है।
for Basel Endgame 3, which
ऊपर
is
इतना
gonna
बड़ा
turn
लिखा
the
हुआ है
banking community upside down?
I don't know how I would make the connection to Basel III. I'll say it's deeply troubling things, obviously, but again, you know, as your point was, if proven. And I mean, I think we have to decide Basel III on its merits, and we're not looking to the FDIC to lead this, by the way.
इसको
We're
देखो,
looking
इसको।
at the Fed to do what the Fed thinks is right. That's what we're
बेचारी
going to do.
परेशान।
We don't look to, and they don't look to us to lead them.
Thank you, Chair Powell. Senator Butler is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Senator Butler is recognized.
Thank you so much, Chair and Chair Powell. Good to see you in person, and thanks for the time to talk. I want to pick up a little bit where Senator Smith was in relationship to housing affordability, and hopefully draw a little bit on the point that you were making about rents. It definitely is an important crisis in my state of California, and I know across the country, where, at least according to the California
कब लगाई है
Department of
यार?
Housing and Urban
सायरा
Development,
कब लगाई है?
renters in
2155
San Diego
अभी
are paying
निकल जाएगी।
about 50%.
देखो इस जगह से
Are you
reject
looking to
होता है
invest
काम।
in Dubai properties? I have just a project for you. Akko Dumore, 50 minutes away from Burj Khalifa.
Majority of renters, more than 3 million households, are spending more than 30% towards rent. Nearly 1/3, more than 1 in 5 million households pay more than 50% of their income towards rent. And the Chicago Fed President Goolsbee even referred to housing as a missing piece of the puzzle
सर
in
ईशान साहब
the
NFP
Fed's
ना
path
मुझे
to lower inflation.
70% to 80%
To
चांस
the,
है
to
गोल्ड
the
गिरेगा।
continued conversation, and I
NFP
know
पे
a point
गिरता
that
है।
you've made that about how inflation has a disproportionate impact on lower income households who are focused on spending more of their monthly budgets on housing. Is there,
GBP
how
JPY
is
का
the
TP
Fed's
बताता हूँ, एक
monetary
मिनट।
policy impacting the supply of affordable rentals?
ये तो हमारी रेंज से ही बाहर निकल गया।
I don't know that we're
TP
affecting the
हमारा
supply
91
of
हो गया।
affordable housing.
GBP वाला
If
बताता
you
हूँ
think
यार।
of affordable housing as something that's connected to some sort of government program.
189.7 TP
That's not our,
ठीक है,
our bailiwick.
लेकिन एक बात
I mean,
याद रखना कि ये
clearly
अगर
interest rates do affect the
रिवर्स होता तो
affordability
आप
of
इसका
housing.
SL 1.8
And,
तक रख
and there was
सकते
a
हो।
key point that you made
ठीक है।
in an earlier
इंशाल्लाह
I
इधर हो
think
जाएगा।
reference about and in your response to Senator Smith about the monetary policy and the calculation of rents. Can you just spend a couple, just briefly talk about that? I want to have one last issue I want to get to before I run out of time.
It's hard to talk about it briefly. It's actually very conceptually challenging to think about housing inflation. Do you include the costs of financing it? Do you include the sale prices? And the answer is we don't. We convert ownership into an imputed rent, and that's 2/3 of homes are owned. And then we actually measure rents, but leases only turn over once a year. So you look at market rents, and what's happening with newly signed leases may be very different from what was happening a year ago. So it's complicated, but the good thing is we understand all that, and we look through that. We
अगर
look at
2120 पे कल
housing
मार्केट मिलती है ना
services
और डे
overall
1
as
इसके
one of
नीचे
the 3 important
क्लोज हो
categories,
गया,
along with
वीकली
non-housing
क्लोजिंग इससे
services
नीचे
and-
फिर तो ये
and
बैरिश
goods
ट्रेंड कर लेगा।
inflation.
लेकिन अगर
Thank you
रिजेक्शन
for
मिल
that.
गई ना तो फिर हम फौरन बाई
And,
की तरफ जाएंगे। फिर वो
in
2200
the
तक
line
जाएगा।
of affordability and housing, again, sort of very general, I think,
BTC
to
का
the
बताता हूँ।
broad monetary policy and state of our economy and unique to California. And I raised this with Secretary Yellen when she was here as well, the insurance gaps
BTC जो है
that
ना selling
are
zone में enter हो रहा
presenting
है।
themselves due to the impact of
यहाँ पे buy नहीं
climate
करना Bitcoin।
change. And where 1 in 5 residents in California live in areas that risk flooding, and all 58 counties have a history of flood damage. And we are seeing more and more insurance providers, home insurance providers, actually withdrawing from the state. You and I had talked a little bit about this in our preparation for today's conversation. Can you talk to me about or share with us how it is that or what you think the impact
इसमें buy
might
नहीं
be of
करना
the
इस
sort of
area में.
protection gap in
अगर ये
insurance
breakout हुआ
coverage
तो then आप
on the
लोग buy कर
overall
सकते हो, ठीक है?
stability of financial
Breakout नहीं हुआ तो then आप
institutions in the
buy नहीं
broader
करना
economy?
इस
So it is clear that insurance of various different kinds, housing insurance, but also automobile insurance and things like that, that's been a significant source of inflation over the last few years. And it's to do with a
देखो किस
million
तरह
different
reject हो
factors.
रही है
It's
market.
nothing that we control from a regulatory or supervisory standpoint.
ये देखिए resistance ना हर दफा
You know,
नीचे बना
in the
हर दफा
longer term,
नीचे की तरफ कर रहा
companies are
है.
withdrawing
इसका मतलब
from
थोड़ा pressure नीचे
writing
है.
insurance in some coastal areas, and you got to think 10 years from now, how are you going to get housing insurance? And you know, maybe the government will have to step in.
Possible
but
इस area पे आयो.
it's a significant issue.
Thank you, Chair Powell.
Thank you.
I was, Senator, it's next. Yeah, Vance. Senator Vance.
अलम
of
जेब
Ohio
बहुत
is
ऊपर बाय कर
recognized.
लिया आपने यार
Thanks,
जल्दबाजी ना किया
Mr.
करो मैंने
Chair,
आपको पहले भी
and,
बताया हुआ
my
था
gratitude to you and the ranking member for doing this hearing, and thank you,
Nehmat
Chairman
bhai, thank
Powell,
you
for
very
being here.
much.
It's good to
ये
see you
बात
again.
मतलब काफी
I
अरसे
think
बाद उर्दू में
these
अपना नाम
hearings
पढ़
are
रहा
always
हूँ
very
यार.
important, actually give us an opportunity to sort of
Thank you.
provide some oversight to what's going on at the Fed and better understand some of the things that you guys are doing that affect our constituents. Now, I wanted to sort of focus on the Basel
अच्छा
III
इसमें ना
regulations,
2162 से
Chairman
जो
Powell,
बाय
and,
किया ना तो वेट कर लें
specifically the
नीचे
way
से
that they
उससे डबल
have,
बाय कर ले एवरेज कर लो
there have been various
55 पे दोनों
proposals to sort
ट्रेड्स
of draw
क्लोज कर
them
दें कल
down
का कल एनएफटी
to focus
बहुत ही
on the regional
खतरनाक है.
banks. And to just go back to sort of one
आज
of
की बाय हो चुकी
the
है
most
यार
significant
ऊपर
crises, obviously, in our banking
57 पे
sector,
जाके प्रॉफिट
of
दे दिए
course, the
मार्केट
collapse
में.
of
देखते हैं.
SVB and First Republic. You and I have spoken in private and I
हाँ
believe in
बिल्कुल सही कह
public,
रहे हैं.
but
एक मिनट जरा
one of the
DXY
concerns that I
देखते हैं.
have is when we talk about increasing capital requirements on the banks, if the banks were under higher capital requirements in the run-up to the crisis, there's maybe an argument that SVB, for example, would have bought more long-term treasuries, which would, of course, would have exposed their balance sheet to even more treasury
ये तो बहुत गिर गया है.
bond
और
risk,
गिरेगा अभी.
and that, of course, would have maybe hastened the collapse of SVB. And I guess I want to start here with, when we talk about, some of the Basel regulations, what was the original intent? In other words, what was the original sort of proposal for which banks would fall under those regulations and which would escape them?
You mean this time around, or I mean earlier on?
This time around.
So it's the 37 largest banks. It's down to, well, there's 4 categories of banks, including the G-SIBs, and this is down through the 4th category. The proposal that's out there now, I think, does extend to Category 4 as well as 3, 2, and 1.
So what's the minimum assets under management that you guys have proposed, the
100
current
billion.
Basel regulations?
100 billion.
100 billion.
Yeah.
And sort of that sort of gets to my concern here, because I know there's some discussion about whether you apply them at $700 billion of AUM or $100 billion of AUM. And maybe you could just sort of
यार
walk
इतनी
me
बड़ी लॉट आपने लगा दी है
through
0.9
that decision
कितनी
process at
इक्विटी
the
है.
Fed, where you guys are, and what would sort of justify drawing down from a $700 billion threshold to a $100 billion threshold.
जी लाइव आते रहा करेंगे इंशाल्लाह कभी लाइव आएंगे गपशप लगाने के लिए क्रूड ऑयल के लेवल्स बता दें यार हम कोशिश करेंगे कि जिस दिन न्यूज़ ना हो वैसे ही लाइव आके सारी चीजों के लेवल निकाल के मैं कर रखूंगा आप खाली इधर पेयर लिख दें कौन कौन से पेयर के ऊपर आप लोग ट्रेड करते हैं मैं उनके ऊपर पूरा एनालिसिस करके आपको समझाऊंगा
tailored level of regulation. Then Category 4 had significant
आजा
tailoring.
पुत्र आजा.
And the question is, we have to ask the question, since SVB was a Category 4, we've got to ask the question, what, if anything, needs to be changed in the way they were regulated, supervised from a capital liquidity
USD CAD के
standpoint.
ऊपर भी चलो बनाता हूँ
There was tailoring all the way down, and then below
सर
100, of course,
250
those are community banks.
डॉलर के
That's
ऊपर
a
ना
different regime as well.
0.28
This
से
makes
ज्यादा
sense.
लाट
We
लगती
want
नहीं
to
है
have,
0.9 पता नहीं
we
क्यों
want to have a
होता है.
diverse banking sector. That's
और
a
मैंने
great
आपको बताया
benefit
भी
to
था
our country and
कि
very
इनके क्वेश्चन
unusual
आंसर
for an
सेशंस
advanced
में और ये
economy.
गोल्ड मार्केट जो है ना एक
So
बार
it's
आप
something
करके
we're
फिर
observing.
डाउन देंगे ये.
Yeah, and I'm sure you know,
इतना
Chairman
डाउन
Powell,
भी
but
नहीं
just to
देंगे
put
अभी
this
तो
on the
ऊपर ही है
record,
ब्रेकआउट से
a
ऊपर ही.
lot of the commercial lending, a lot of the real estate lending, a lot of the consumer lending, about half of that lending, consumer lending, is provided by the regional banks. I believe the Huntington in my home state of Columbus is the #1 SBA lender in
शुक्र है
the
को
entire
जवान भी आया
country. So
सवाल
these,
पूछने के लिए.
to your point, I think these do provide incredibly important benefits to our economy. And you hear a lot of people talk about the American economic miracle, and I do wonder if part of that is because we don't have the same type of financial system that has sort of dominated in Western Europe and other first world economies. I'm curious, in the
JPY कौन
process
सा USD
of
JPY
amending the
वो भी
Basel
डाउन जा रहा हो अब शायद वो
requirements,
उसका 46 47
have
के
you
एरिया
guys
से जो
made
ना
a
146
decision about where
147
to
से
set the threshold
बाय
yet, and when do
कर
you
सकते
expect
हो
to set
आप ये
that
देखा मैंने
threshold?
47 से बाय
We
दी
haven't
थी
made any
ये
final
भी
decisions. We
निकल
put
गया
out for
ऊपर
proposals some
Right.
months
इस जगह
ago,
से
a proposal, and we've gotten a
46.5
lot of comments, as I'm sure you're aware. We're chewing through those and
एक
digesting
बंदे को
them,
मैंने बाय
and
भी दी
we're
थी ना
just beginning now to sit down and talk about the changes that will appropriately make to the original proposal.
And when do you expect to sort of issue a final proposal?
I think it's going to take some time. I think it's more important to do it right than it is to do it fast. My guess is we'll get through this and be done over the course of this year. But it could be faster than that. It could be slower than that.
So I'm wondering, just being mindful of time, I have about 30 seconds left. Would you be willing to commit to say that in the process of amending, the Fed will remove the regional bank drawdown and limit Basel's application directly to the G-SIBs or $700 billion or above?
I can't get that
एक
specific.
मिनट
at this
देना मैं
point,
आपको
but,
बताता हूँ
we're
आपकी
clearly
बात देखता
looking
हूँ ये
at
नहीं
the
जाएगा अभी
whole
40
issue.
50 जी
I
तोड़ेगा तो
appreciate that.
48 जाए तो
And
करेगा
again, I just repeat, Chairman Powell, given what actually happened with the banking sector with SVB and First Republic, I just
1700 का
encourage
लॉस
you
शुरू हो
guys
गया
not
यार
to apply a
इतना
regulation
ज्यादा
that
कैसे
doesn't actually solve the underlying problem. And I fear that if you apply this to banks of $100 billion and above, you actually
अगर
are
आप
doing just
$1 की
that.
भी
So,
लाट आपने
with
61 से
that
लिया
in
तब भी
mind,
1000 बनता है
I'll
आपको
yield. Thanks for
1700
sharing.
कैसे हो
Thanks,
गया
Senator Vance. Senator Tester of Montana is recognized.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman Brown.
भाई
and
गोल्ड
thank
मार्केट
you
जो है
for
ना
being
वो
here,
अभी ऊपर से
Chair
रिजेक्ट हो
Powell.
चुकी है एक
We
बार हमने
appreciate your work.
2148 से बाय किया
in a difficult
57 के
situation,
ऊपर
but
क्लोज
I
कर
think
दिया
you've
मजीद
done
देख रहे हैं कि नीचे से
a really good
रिजेक्शन
job,
मिले
and
तो
so thank
कुछ
you for
करें
that.
ये डिमांड जोन
Look,
आपके
at
सामने है
success at the Fed
ये
on
ब्रेकआउट
your
है
mandate for
इससे
strong
नीचे कोई
employment
बड़ी
and
कैंडल
stable
क्लोज
prices
होती है
is
देखो ये
critical for
क्लोज
small
नहीं हुई फौरन ही
businesses
ये तो
on Main Street, for
एम
farmers, for
15 है ना
ranchers,
कोई बड़ी कैंडल
for
H4
Montana
नीचे क्लोज हो
families.
तो देन ये
You follow all the
2141
metrics.
की तरफ जा सकता है
From your perspective, where is the economy at now, and where's it going?
The economy's growing at a healthy, sustainable, solid, strong pace. And that's one thing. Second thing I'd say is the labor market is very strong and quite tight
स्प्रेड
still.
ज्यादा है अच्छा स्प्रेड ज्यादा है कौन सा ब्रोकर है भाई इतना
3.7%
स्प्रेड दे रहा है
unemployment for the last 24 months. That's the
215 से
longest
बाय
period
करना
since,
है
50 years.
आपकी
And the
बाकी
third thing is inflation.
यार
Inflation
वीडियो
was
मैंने
too
बनाई थी
high. It's
एडिटिंग
come
करना रह
down
गया है
very
क्योंकि आज
sharply since the
फिर बिजी होगा
beginning of
कल
this
लाजमी
year.
वीडियो आएगी
If you look
इंशाल्लाह
at the
ताला
12-month
लाजमी आएगी
number,
ये
the
प्रॉमिस है
headline
मेरा
number has come down from the 5s down to 2.4. And the core number is at 2.8. I think it was at 4.9 a year ago.
ब्रेक
So
इवन एट हो
these
गया
are
अच्छा
big
ये बाई थे जो
declines.
कह रहे
So
थे मुझे
we're in a
सेल
very
ली हुई है
different place and a healthy
वो
place.
सेल वाले बाई किधर है
We're
वो
gonna
अपनी
use our
ट्रेड्स
tools to
को
try and
मैनेज
keep that
करें
strong
51
economy,
वाले
keep that strong labor market while we continue to make progress on inflation.
51
One
से
of the
बाय
areas where there
स्कैल्पिंग कर
has
सकते हैं
been,
वैसे लॉन्ग टर्म नहीं है
inflation, and I don't exactly know where it's at now, but
ये
food
विंटेज से जान
rose
छुड़ाएं
quite
यार ये बहुत
rapidly.
बुरे बुरे स्पाइक
And by
देता
the
है
way, I'm a
आप ना
farmer. We
अलमजेब
didn't
भाई
get
मुझसे
much of that. In
कांटेक्ट
fact, we
करें मैं
didn't
आपको
get any of
बेटर
it. Prices
सबसे
now
कम
compared to what they
स्प्रेड
were,
वाला अकाउंट आपको देता हूँ सबसे
a
कम
year
स्प्रेड
ago
वाला
are actually,
आप हैरान हो जाएंगे स्प्रेड सुन
compared to
के
where they're 6 years ago, they're up, but compared to where they a year ago, they're down.
ECN
And so
account
my
देता हूँ
question to you,
ECN
Chairman Powell, is there anything you do specifically to deal with food costs?
2142 से बाय कर सकते हैं
So
जी
as
जी
you-
ये
I'm telling a
2141 को
farmer
बड़ा
business,
जबरदस्त
but,
एरिया
if
एक
you
दफा
look at
आए
the
सही तो
food
इसको मैं
cost
खुद
to the
तेल
consumer,
लगाऊंगा
part of that is commodity costs.
लेकिन
and
मुझे
that
नहीं
was
लगता
partly
कि इधर
spiked,
आएगा
as because of Ukraine, grains and oil and that kind of thing. But the rest of it is a lot of costs in the supply chain from when it leaves the farm to get collected and processed and trucked around and then put on the shelves and then the stores. And
drive
all
brokers,
those costs are just part
मैं
of the
इसको नहीं
general
जानता
economy.
इतना
So
ज़्यादा
as the labor market cools off from its overheated status 2 years
मुझे
ago,
इस टाइम
you
मेरे
will
नज़दीक
see,
जो है ना
and you
सबसे
have
अच्छा
seen,
ब्रोकर
food
जो मैं
inflation
समझता हूँ ना वो
flattening
एक्सेम
out. And
ग्लोबल है
so,
एक्सेम
the
ग्लोबल और
really
एक्सनेस
high
अच्छे
rates of
ब्रोकर हैं
inflation
इनके
have come down.
कुछ
The
अकाउंट्स हैं
prices,
जो
of course,
बहुत ही
have
कम
not.
और एक दो दुबई का ब्रोकर
Correct.
मैं ऐड कर रहा हूँ
I
इंशाल्लाह
would just
उनके
say
साथ
that
मेरी मीटिंग चल
cattle's
रही है
doing,
जो ही आती है तो उसमें मैं
better.
बोनसेस भी
Grain
ऐड करवा रहा हूँ
actually has
एग्जाम का
dropped
बोनस
the price
50%
of the
ऑफर
farm.
आई हुई है
I
उससे
don't
फायदा
want to get
उठाए
into that
कौन सा
debate with you
अकाउंट
at
इसके
all
वो स्प्रेड
because
वाला है
we probably agree
और
that it
इंशाल्लाह
take
ताला
too long,
सबसे
take too
कम
much
स्प्रेड
time.
वाला
We've got other
अकाउंट
stuff to
आपको मैं
talk about.
दिलवाऊंगा
learning
सबसे
from.
कम जिसके अंदर नो
You
स्वैप नो
discussed
transmission
in previous hearings the impact
जो ही
of the
एंट्री लगाओगे
pandemic,
साथ ही प्लस में जाएगी
shutdowns and
सबको उस
supply
पर।
chain issues have had
जिसने
on economies globally.
अच्छा ब्रोकर फाइंड
How
करना है
does
ना
US
वो
economy
मुझे
look
इनबॉक्स कर दे,
today
मैं इंशाल्लाह
compared
उसकी
to
लिस्ट बनाता हूँ
our
और इसी वीक
competitor
में मैं आपको
nations,
गुड न्यूज़
particularly
दूंगा।
China?
मेरी 2-3 बड़े ब्रोकर
start
के
with
साथ
the
मीटिंग चल
advanced
रही है
economies.
और मैं
You
उनसे
know,
बाजी
we're
दूं तो
doing
कि
the
मेरा
best we
जो है
can
ना
to
वो
be.
हमारे क्लाइंट को
Got
जो
the
है ना हमारे
strongest
जितने भी
growth and
मेंबर
the
हैं
lowest inflation
उनको
of the
लो
advanced economies. China
स्प्रेड वाला
is a
अकाउंट
whole
दिया
different
जाए
story.
ECN
China's having
ECN अकाउंट दें,
significant
कोई फेक
difficulties
स्पाइक नहीं, कोई
with
कुछ
its
भी नहीं, नो
economy
कमीशन नो
right
स्वैप।
now,
तो
and
अगर
they're in
वो
a very difficult
सक्सेसफुल होता है
place
तो
to
आप सब लोगों को
sort of
इंशाल्लाह मैं
maneuver.
वीडियो बनाऊंगा उसके ऊपर।
And so, to repeat that, what I heard you say is that the
हाँ,
economy
41
of the
फिर
United
41 जा
States
सकता है।
is basically in better shape than any other economy in the world?
Any other
बस
major
ये
economy, yes.
Yes.
अब
Okay.
देखो स्पीड देखें
Look,
गोल्ड।
one of the other
आप ना
challenges that
आलमजेब
there's
भाई
housing
आप लोग को हेज करना
in
पड़ेगा
communities all
48
across this
47
country,
अदरवाइज आपका
whether you're in
अकाउंट
Montana,
लिक्विडेट हो
whether you're in
सकता
a
है।
city in Ohio,
अपने अकाउंट को प्रोटेक्ट भी करना है। ये देखो ये जो
workforce
ये है ना
housing in particular is a
2147 से
top,
नीचे या सीपी से नीचे आप
top priority,
वो
top
लगा
commodity,
दें,
so to speak.
सेल स्टॉप लगा दें,
Plenty of folks, great
क्योंकि
organizations are working to
मार्केट अगर
address
गिर
this. I
गई
meet
तो
them
फिर
every day and I
मुझे
appreciate
नहीं
the
पता
work
कि
they're
आपके
doing.
अकाउंट सर्वाइव करवाएगा
But
नहीं।
how do these housing supplies issues show up in the data that the FOMC uses to make decisions?
So housing prices don't go into the data. Housing
जी बिल्कुल,
starts
जो
and
वीडियो
at
देखते हैं
renovations
आप
and things like that
यकीन
are
करें,
just
एक
business
लेडी ने मुझे
activity, and
कांटेक्ट किया
that
है,
shows up.
उसने $18,000 को
But
$1.5
when it comes
पे
to
ले गई सिर्फ
inflation,
सीपी के ऊपर
we
ट्रेड करती है।
convert ownership
बेशक दिन में 2
into
एसएल हूं पर वो
imputed
रहती
rent,
स्टिक
and
है,
then we
उससे
look
ऊपर
at
है तो
rents.
बाय,
And so
हर दफा
that's
बाय।
how we look at all that. So we're not directly affected by changes in housing
लाइव चैनल
prices,
मंडे
but
से
those
इंशाल्लाह स्टार्ट हो
companies
जाएगा, वो
those
पीसी
will
आ गया
drive
है,
rents
उसकी
up.
सेटिंग के लिए
So
इंशाल्लाह
is it
फ्राइडे
fair
को
to
मैं कर दूंगा,
ask, are there
मंडे
economic
से
trends that you
लाइव
see
कर
for
देंगे,
housing?
24 घंटे लाइव रहेगा जिसमें ऊपर
Yes, so
आपको लेवल में
there's
बता
two big
दूंगा
things going
जो
on.
और
One is
डिफरेंट
we
पेयर
have
के
this
ऊपर भी चल रहे
underlying
होंगे।
shortage
गोल्ड
of housing,
पहले नंबर पे
and
होगा।
it's due to things like, difficulties of zoning. A lot of the close in to cities, places that were already built, and so more difficult to get zoning, more difficult to get people and materials and all that. That's one thing, and that's not going away. Then there's just a ton of things happening because of the pandemic, because of inflation, because of higher rates. And those are, in the short term, those have really, they're weighing on the housing market. But as rates come down and that all goes through the economy, we're still going to be back to a place where we don't have enough housing.
जी
Once
ब्रेक इवन
again,
हिट हो गया।
thank you, Chairman Powell, for your work. I very much appreciate it. Thank you, Chairman Brown.
Thanks, Senator Tester. Senator Kramer of North Dakota.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Powell, good to see you. Thank you for being here. It's been a rather uneventful couple of days for you, considering you've spent 2 days in this place. And I'm not going to upset you.
अभी क्या स्पाइक लगा के
But
फिर
I
देखो
did appreciate
ये देख लें फिर ऊपर किस तरह मूव हुआ है।
response earlier to Senator Scott when he asked about immigration, when you said you know the Fed hasn't
एक
been
मिनट की
assigned
इनगल्फिंग छोड़ दें भाई।
So I want to bring up something else you haven't been assigned to that you and I have talked about over the years, and that, of course, is climate, the role of climate
क्या नाम था इनका भाई का वो
risk in banking.
जी जी ऊपर चला जाएगा, अभी चला जाएगा, आप अपनी क्लोज कर देना प्रॉफिट में बाय।
We should stick to our knitting, I think is one of yours. Stay in our lane, similar to what you said probably to Senator Scott.
ये एरिया जो कलर सेलेक्ट किया हुआ इसीलिए सेलेक्ट किया उन्होंने कि यहाँ से आप अटेम्प्ट करें। आप देखिए न्यूज टाइम पे ना रिस्क होता है, एक दफा जो चीज चल पड़ती है ना फिर दोबारा आपको वो नहीं है कि आप दोबारा से बार-बार आपको मौके दें। ठीक है?
Congress somewhere along the line give the Fed authority over climate policy as well, or is that another one of those things that somebody just took on? And I realize you're not the dictator of the Fed, only the chairman of the Fed, but I'd be interested in, as the chairman, your views on it.
Our assignment is the safety and soundness of banks.
बस सिंपल है कि इसके पास है तो यहाँ पे बिल्कुल इसके ये देखो कितना एसएल है, सिर्फ 15 पिप्स का एसएल है यार। अटेम्प्ट तो करना पड़ेगा ना आपको, यहाँ पे एसएल रखें और इसके एरिया से किसी जगह भी बाय करें और ऊपर जाए क्लोज कर दो।
Scenarios, not stress scenarios, climate scenarios, so that the banks are already doing this.
वीडियो मेरी डिस्क्रिप्शन में मौजूद है, मैं डिस्क्रिप्शन में बोल रहा हूँ, वीडियो मेरी मौजूद है हाउ कैसे ट्रेड करनी है।
So we do
वो
that.
आप
We
देख
also
लेना
said that
जाके,
we'd
मैं
offer
आपको बता भी देता
guidance
हूँ।
on not on the level of climate risk or anything like that, just on what you had to do to be in a
यार ये
position to
सवाल सुनने
assess.
लगे।
And that's, for my thinking, that's it. That's what we're doing. And we're not doing it. There are no new
मेरी वजह से
initiatives.
कैसे
We're not
लॉस हो
gonna
गया
change
भाई।
our capital requirements to reflect
अपना भी कोई अकल यूज कर लिया करो, मैं तो डेली वीडियो आप लोगों के लिए बनाता हूँ, उसी को फॉलो करो तो कभी लॉस ना हो।
a climate policy
हर
maker.
चीज का एसएल होता है
That
ना।
is really the business of elected officials.
Very good, thank you. I'm going to bring up one other topic. I don't know that's been brought up today, and that's central bank digital currency. I think from a lot of my friends out there, I think there's some, well, I know there's some confusion. I mean, I'm easy to confuse, but there are a lot of people that get confused about
बंदे को
what
शर्म
is
आनी
meant
चाहिए
by
यार
the
आपको
administration's,
कि अगर आप एक
admonition
ट्रेडर हैं
to
तो आपको
continue
पता है कि एक मैं
researching,
ट्रेड ले रहा हूँ
experimenting,
और
looking
दूसरा
at
मुझे ये
some
समझ में
sort
नहीं
of
आ रही कि आपका लॉस हुआ
central
कैसे है
bank digital
इवन जो
currency.
लोग हमारे
I think
उस पे भी
people
हैं स्विंग पे भी उनको भी हमने
back home look at that
94
and
के
go,
ऊपर
oh my
हैज करवा
gosh,
के बाय ट्रेड दी
they're
है
going to control
वो भी प्रॉफिट में
this
अल्हम्दुलिल्लाह
now.
काम कर रहे हैं इस टाइम
And could you maybe just differentiate a little bit what people think of in terms of a
ऊपर जा रहा
Bitcoin
आपकी
or
वजह से
their held
आलमजेब में
digital
बैठा हूँ वरना
currencies
मैंने लाइव
versus
क्लोज
what
कर
is
देनी
central
थी
bank digital currency, who, in my view, should emulate cash, right? It
इंशाल्लाह
still
ऊपर
should be
जाएगा तो
about the
55 के
dollar,
ऊपर
not about
एवरेज करें
some
आप नीचे
different
से
kind of
अगर
currency.
लिए है तो
Could you
एवरेज
just sort of
करें
help people back home better understand why they shouldn't
try.
be quite so frightened?
First of all, I want to say that we're nowhere near recommending or let alone adopting a central bank digital currency in any form. But the idea is that as technology has evolved, money has become digital. So, but the government doesn't issue digital money. It's digital. If you look at your bank account, people don't hold those physical dollars. They're digital. So the thought was that the government could create a digital form of money that people could then transfer among themselves. Now, of course, that raises a concern that if that were a government account, that the government would see all your transactions, and that's just something we would not stand for or do or propose here in the United States. That is how
स्विंग वाले तो हैज
how
है
it
ना
works
इस
in
टाइम
China, for
उन्हीं को
example.
ट्रेड दिया
But
आज
that's
भाई
not
की
what if we were to ever to do something like this, and we're a very long way from even thinking about it, we would do this through the banking
बस
system.
जो वीडियो नहीं
The
देखते ना
last
वो
thing we would want,
उनका अल्लाह
we
वारिस
the
है
Federal Reserve would be to have individual accounts for all Americans or any Americans for that matter. Only banks have accounts at the Fed. And that's the way we're going to keep it. So it's just really it's a question of following technology as it evolves and in a way that serves the public better. People don't need to worry about a central bank digital currency. Nothing like that is remotely close to happening anytime soon.
That was very helpful. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Chairman.
Kramer. Senator Cortez Masto of Nevada is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Powell, great to see you again. Thank you for all of your good work. I want to talk a little bit about the commercial real estate and what's happening there. The Financial Stability Oversight Council's 2023 annual report identified commercial real estate as a financial risk. And the Fed's monetary report also noted commercial real estate prices continue to decline, especially in the office, retail, and multifamily sectors. I'm especially concerned that because of the low levels of transactions in the office sector, prices have not yet fully reflected the true decline in the value. So can you expand on the emerging risks the Federal Reserve has identified in the commercial real estate market, one? And then I'm curious, can you discuss the compound risks identified in commercial real estate lending, particularly at banks with large CRE concentrations and high fractions of uninsured deposits?
Sure. Let me see. I think there are just very, very few transactions in commercial real estate right now, particularly in the troubled areas. So it's not a question of prices still falling. It's a question that you don't have the kind of price discovery. You just have to assume that the prices are very low and have come
इसी
down a
रेंज
lot.
में फिर रहा है यहाँ से ऊपर जा रहा है
So
वहाँ से
on commercial real estate, we have a secular change in people working from home. This is one big part of it. That means that in many cities, the downtown office district is
इसको
very
तोड़ा है ना तो फिर ये
underpopulated. There are
इधर
empty
रीटेस्ट करके
buildings
यहाँ तक तो
in
जा
many
सकता है
major and minor cities. It also means that all the retail that was there to service the thousands and thousands of people who work in those buildings, they're under pressure too. And banks will have made loans to many of those buildings, not all of them, but many. So this we've known for some years. And so what do? We have identified the banks that have high commercial real estate concentrations, particularly office and retail, and other ones that have been affected a lot. We identify them, and we are in dialogue with them around, do you have your arms around this problem? Do you have enough capital?
अगर 2050 से सेल लिए
Do you have
सेल
a
लिए तो
plan?
फिर
You're
टीपी
going to
क्या
take
होगा
losses here.
दा का नाम
Are
लो
you being
2150
truthful
क्या
with
क्या कह रहे
yourself
हो
and with your owners?
बाय
And so we've
बाय
been
लिए
working
या
with
सेल
them. And
लिए
so for some time, we've been doing that. And, this is a problem that we'll be working on for
सुबह तक तो वैसे ही चली
years
जाएगी
more, I'm
अभी थोड़ा
sure.
तंग
There will be
करेगी
bank failures, but this is not the big banks. If you look at the very big banks, it's not a first
इसलिए नहीं
order
कर रहे
issue for
शॉर्ट
many
इसलिए
of
नहीं कर
the
रहे कि
very large
न्यूज़
banks.
टाइम
It's
पे
more,
इनगल्फिंग काम नहीं करती ये
smaller
रूल है
and medium-sized
जब
banks
न्यूज़
that
टाइम
have
ना हो
these
तो फिर हम
issues.
इनगल्फिंग को
We're
देखते हैं
working with them. We're getting through it.
स्कॉटलैंड ओके
I think it's manageable is the word I would use, but it's a very active thing for us and the other regulators, and it will be for some time.
ठीक है, अकाउंट हैज ही रहने दो
Do you have
फराज साहब।
concerns?
अब जब ऊपर जाएगी
well,
रिजेक्शन मिलेगी तो खोलना ना फिर।
Let me just ask you this. As you're talking with these
Okay,
small,
news की voice
medium-sized
थोड़ा कम
banks, because we know that there's always could be a contagion, which we've seen in the past, do you have concerns that if they fail, that somehow this is going to impact?
न्यूज़ की आवाज़ थोड़ी सी कम कर दी है। मैं आपको ये बता रहा हूँ कि भाई ये नीचे से इस एरिया से पहले भी बाय दे चुका है। मैंने पिछली लाइव में भी आपको बताया था कि आप 40, 50 और 48 के एरिया से इवन हमने प्रीमियम के अंदर भी ये बाय जोन दिए हुए थे, जिसके बाद मार्केट 70 टू 80 पिप्स ऊपर जाती है, बल्कि 90 पिप्स ऊपर जाके प्रॉफिट क्लोज कराती है, फिर नीचे आती है, फिर इस एरिया से उठाती है और यहाँ पे चली जाती है। अब अगर आप देखें तो ऑलमोस्ट फिर आपको एक बार फिर 60 पिप्स का प्रॉफिट मार्केट दे चुकी है, और अगर ये इसके ऊपर क्लोज करती है तो फिर थोड़ा सा नीचे आएगी, फिर पुल बैक करेगी और फिर 61 और 60 की साइड पे जाएगी, जो कि रिजेक्शन जोन है। ठीक है ना। सेलिंग जोन जो है ना, मैं आपको थोड़ा सा बताता चलूं। सेल आप 57 एरिया से देख सकते हो, या फिर 61 के एरिया से देख सकते हो, या फिर आप अपना बाय प्रॉफिट वहां से पे अनलोड कर सकते हो। ठीक है, ज्यादा जो प्योर सेल होगी ना वो तभी होगी जब ब्रेकआउट से नीचे मार्केट आएगी। देखो ये ब्रेकआउट है, इससे नीचे H4 क्लोज होगी तो देन आप मजीद सेल की तरफ देख सकते हो, अदरवाइज इस एरिया से आप सेलिंग स्कैल्पिंग देख सकते हो। ठीक,
Senator Warner, but how is the Federal Reserve working with the Federal Home Loan Banks to ensure that banks
जी मैं
establish
व्हाट्सएप नंबर मिल
to
सकता है
borrow
जी।
at the Fed's
आप मेरा चैनल
discretion?
ओपन करें, सबसे ऊपर व्हाट्सएप नंबर दिया हुआ है, आप मुझे मैसेज करें, डायरेक्ट मेरे पास आ जाएगा। ठीक है, मैं इधर टाइप भी कर देता हूँ।
Banks were moving their loan from the Federal Home Loan Bank to the Fed, so we need to have smooth transfer. We need to be in good touch with them. Even more important than that, though, is that banks, any bank in the United States, needs to be in touch with the discount window, know how to be able to access it, be able to access it, have appropriate collateral, have control of that collateral. You know, in many cases, it was incredibly inefficient and took a long time for
अच्छा
banks
जी,
to actually
ओके हो गया
go through that
जनाब,
funding.
ऐसा लग रहा है कि आप
The
गोल्ड
Federal
मार
Home
के
Loan
नीचे
Banks
आएगा।
are actually
हाँ,
ahead
ये
of us
एक
in
इस एरिया से
technology.
नीचे आ
We
सकता
know
है,
that
ये
we
जो
need to
57 है ना।
invest in technology to modernize the discount window, and also we need to do more to make to get our banks, all of them, in touch with the discount window in a way that they can use it quickly should they need to do so.
Thank you.
Cortez Masto, Senator Haggerty of Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Brown. Welcome, Chairman Powell. Under your tenure, Mr. Chairman, the Fed has taken the stance that the 2% inflation target shouldn't be viewed as a
आप ना
snapshot
वो
in time,
अहमद
but
भाई
rather
यार
needs to
से
be
बहुत
achieved,
अच्छी
quote,
ट्रेड मिली है।
sustainably.
ये
When
बहुत अच्छी
inflation
ट्रेड
was
मिली है।
running well
ओके हो गया,
above the
ऐसा
2%
लग रहा है कि
target back
आपको
in 2021 and
जी
early
नाइस
2022,
कमेंट्री, थैंक
the
यू।
Fed was
बस
patient
62 तक जाए।
and allowed
सॉरी
rates
सर,
to offset the
2050
below
से
target
बाय ली।
inflation that
ओके
had
ओके,
occurred in the years prior.
2050 से ही
It
आप
strikes me as
फिर
odd
2150
now
से।
that while we're still well above target inflation and have been well above for the prior year, markets seem to expect the Fed to immediately cut
सर
even
वॉल्यूम
before
नहीं
we've reached
दिखाया।
the 2% inflation
वॉल्यूम भी
threshold.
देख लो यार, कौन
So
सा
my
वॉल्यूम
question
है
is this: if the inflation rate reaches 2%,
वॉल्यूम ऐड कर लेते हैं
would
इधर
that
से।
be considered a return to the target rate on a sustainable basis? Or is it still the case that inflation would need to more or less overcorrect to well below 2% before the Fed makes the rate cut adjustments?
It would take us a while to really get comfortable that inflation had settled in sustainably at 2%. But that's not our test for changing interest rates. Interest rates right now are well into restrictive territory. They're well above neutral. And we've said we would not wait for inflation to get down to 2%, because if you wait that, monetary policy works with long and variable lags. So we've said, for some years that we would start restoring the federal funds rate to a more normal, almost neutral level. We're far from neutral now.
Yeah.
And so, we do plan.
वॉल्यूम भी
assuming
जो
the
है ना वो
economy moves
इसको टच कर
along the
सकता
lines
है,
we expect, we do
फिर
plan
देखते हैं कि इधर किस
on
साइड पे जाता
starting the process of dialing
है। हाँ,
back
ये इसको
restrictive.
टच करने
just
के बाद
trying to
फिर
square
डाउन
away to the
साइड पे
symmetry.
जाएगा।
I know we sort
ये
of
देखा रिजेक्शन
allowed
मिल रही है।
the economy to overshoot when inflation was high, and we sort of made up for prior years of low inflation. I'm trying to square that with the fact that
We didn't actually do that. We adopted a framework
Thank you,
that said
Sidra.
we would do that, but then we got suddenly, a few months later, we got almost an explosion of very high inflation. That's not what we were looking. We said, moderately above or modestly above 2%. This was not modestly above 2%, and we reacted we thought that the mistake we made was we thought
यार
that
ये जो वेंटेज है ना सर, इसका
would
बहुत ज्यादा
work,
स्वैप है, कमीशन भी है,
that
स्वैप भी है, और
the
स्प्रेड भी इतना
granted,
ज्यादा है।
which means it
आप
doesn't
ना
equate to
अलमजेब मेरा
risk
नंबर नोट कर लें,
because
मेरे डिस्क्रिप्शन में पड़ा हुआ है,
one, that
तो
that was
आप
not
मुझसे
the
रब्ता
case
करें।
that
मैं
we
आपको
could
यूके
get
का
into
सबसे
get
बेहतरीन
some
ब्रोकर
right
बताता हूँ,
outcomes
जिसके
right away
ऊपर
with
आपको
Now, I think
अच्छा मजे की बात बताऊं, अभी मेरी उनसे
we're in the
बात तो
right
चल रही है
direction. We're
CWG
beginning to
से।
see,
वो
beginning to
आपको
become more confident
जो
that
बोनस
those
देते हैं
outcomes can happen.
2000 के ऊपर 2000 का
We do
बोनस
get
देते
that
हैं, और
confidence
एक
in that
सर्टन ट्रेड के बाद
it'll be
आप उनका
beginning
बोनस भी
to
विड्रा कर
get
सकते
back
हो।
the level of
मजे की
motivation
बात है ना,
so
कोई
that we
ब्रोकर
can
ऐसे नहीं देता।
drive the economy
एग्जाम
towards
ग्लोबल भी
sustainable
आपको ट्रेड के लिए देता,
moral
उक्टाफेक्स तो
policy
वो तो
as
उसका
the
है ही,
economy gets
वो
back
है
on.
क्रेडिट है, वो तो बोनस है ही नहीं।
And talk about that.
सिल्वर
We've
का
seen
बता दें,
a dramatic expansion of the Fed's balance sheet over the past couple of decades. In 2005, it was
ये लो
bigger than
सिल्वर।
$800 billion.
चलें जी,
It's at
सिल्वर,
7.5
सिल्वर
trillion
दोबारा से
today.
अपनी डिमांड जोन,
It's doubled since the
सॉरी किधर
pandemic
गया
program
सिल्वर,
was
बोल रहा
underway.
हूँ,
And through
कितने गया
quantitative
ये
tapering,
है।
the Fed is attempting to reduce
ये
its
सिल्वर गोल्ड के साथ ही चलता है, इसके अंदर भी
if it's
वॉल्यूम
not
डाला हुआ है।
focused
देखें,
on
ये सारा
curbing
स्पीच की वजह से वॉल्यूम डाला
government spending, tends to just continue to be profligate. We're running now a
है।
$1
गोल्ड
trillion
गया
deficit every 100
गया।
days. And we're flooding the market with treasury debt, and we're putting upward pressure on interest rates as a result. What I think gets lost on everybody is
आलमजेब भाई, आप तो खुश हो ना?
the spending levels will
देख लो,
ultimately
इस एरिया को
drop
टच करा
further
दिया है।
when it comes to lowering interest rates, not to mention there's a tacit expectation that the Fed will step in once the markets can no longer
देख लो, इस एरिया को, ये एरिया तो टूट जाए ना, फिर इस एरिया की तरफ जाएगा। ये ना टूटा तो फिर दोबारा से वापस इस तरफ आ जाएगा।
your objectives may be
जाओ जाओ
very
जाओ
much
जाओ।
at odds with the behavior of our fiscal policy. Am I missing something here, Mr. Chairman, or does
कैसे वीडियो
increased
नीचे
net
जी, मैं
issuance
शेयर
from
कर
the
दूंगा
Treasury
इंशाल्लाह।
lead to higher rates?
I mean, in principle, more supply should lead to modestly higher rates, but that's not going to affect what we do. That's not a problem for us.
जी मिल जाएंगे,
Our
यूएसडीटी चाहिए,
balance sheet
एक्सनेस के
policy
डॉलर
is
चाहिए, वो भी मिल
running
जाएंगे। अच्छा
very
प्लेयर
much as
बाई
expected.
लॉर्ड कौन सा
We've
यूज
increased the
करते
size
हैं?
of our
अच्छे प्लेयर,
holdings
अच्छे
by
प्लेयर बड़ी लूट यूज करते हैं,
almost
लेकिन
$1.5 trillion.
चलो
I
भाई।
hear you. I think it's troubling that we continue to put
बायर्स
physical pressure by continuing to put, again, we're running a deficit of $1
क्या
trillion
बकवास
every
करी
100
जा रहे
days.
हैं,
The
देख लो,
issuance is required to
और
deal with
गिरा
that.
रहे हैं इस अपने
We're putting a lot more
DXY को।
pressure
DXY
on the Fed
और गिर
and
गया है,
making your job harder.
इसके
I
ऊपर
think we
क्लोजिंग
take
दे
that
दे,
into
M15
consideration.
भी दे दे, फिर
Another
अगला टारगेट इसका
component of this
61
topic
होगा,
by
और
your
यहाँ
colleague
से
Governor
रिजेक्शन ना
Waller
मिली तो
said
70।
he'd like the Fed to shift its holdings toward a larger share of short-term
यार
treasuries.
इस जगह से हमारी
Back prior to the
ब्रेक,
financial
ये
crisis,
देखो,
about a
जिन
third of
लोगों
the
ने
Fed's holdings
48
were
से
in
उठाया, उन
bills. Now
लोगों का
they're
तो ब्रेक
around
इवन नहीं हुआ।
3% of your total securities holdings. Do you share the goal with Governor Waller? And if so, how long will it take us to get there?
Take a while, that's
आज
that's
मैंने
an
बहुत
issue
क्लियर बताया था कि
in
सेल
our
नहीं करना
FOMC meeting in a
गोल्ड,
couple of
बिल्कुल
weeks. We're
सिर्फ
going
बाय
to
की
do
तरफ
our first
देखो।
really deep dive
बेशक
into
नीचे जाए
the balance sheet.
तो
That's
आप
one of the
मजीद
issues I don't
अच्छी
think
ले
we'll
सकते
deal
हो,
with
लेकिन
at this
करना
meeting, but
बाय।
over time, you'd love not to
कितना
own a lot
हुआ
of MBS,
इसका?
and I could see a case for shortening the maturity, but it's not something, it's not something that would happen quickly, and it's, we're not actively looking at that. That's sort of a longer term aspiration.
अगर यहाँ पे देखें तो 1 to
Just one
4
final
और
point, Mr.
पहली
Chair. You and
दफा
I've talked about
मार्केट
this
की
before.
57, अब
We're
इसको
in an
टूटा तो
election year.
ऊपर तरफ
We're getting
जाएगी
a lot of
इंशाल्लाह।
pressure, I hear, from lawmakers to adjust rates. I'm not telling you to raise
अच्छा
rates or
सर,
lower rates,
हमारा
but I'm just here to emphasize the
एक क्या
fact
लिखा
that
हुआ
the
है यार,
credibility of
2100
the Fed depends on
चाहता
your
है कि
remaining data-driven. The credibility of
कैसे,
our
समझ नहीं
currency
आ
as
रही यहाँ पे
the
सवाल
reserve
की मुझे।
currency of the world depends on that, and I encourage you to continue to maintain that posture. Thank you.
Will do.
Thanks, Senator Haggard. Senator Warren of Massachusetts is ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So it's been a year
हाँ, CWG
since we
सेफ
had
है,
the second,
ठीक है।
third, and fourth largest
हाँ,
bank
सेफ है,
failures in
जबरदस्त
American
ब्रोकर है।
history.
चाइना का बहुत
Three
बड़ा
bank
ब्रोकर है,
executives
यूके और
reported the
एफसीए
problem.
से
The Fed,
रेगुलेटेड है,
as the
मैंने
chief
पूरा इसकी तहकीक
regulator
की
of
हुई
the
है।
biggest
सर
banks,
सल की तैयारी
was
की
part of the
जाए।
problem.
यार
Under
सेल
your
बिल्कुल इस
leadership
एरिया
and
से देखा ना,
direction,
ये
the Fed steadily
इतना तो
weakened
इसका
the
आना
banks
चाहिए
for
यार,
the
कितना आना
biggest
चाहिए मैं बताता हूँ
billionaire
अभी, एक मिनट
banks,
इसको मैं काट दूँ।
exactly the banks that failed last March. In other words, Chair Powell, you failed to do your job to keep these big banks in line. Now, when these banks
55 और
failed,
54 के
you
एरिया
went
तक
into
तो आए।
spin mode, promising that the Fed would do better. After years of hemming and hawing, you finally agreed to put in place Basel Basel III rules that would strengthen capital standards for the biggest banks. And I mean the biggest banks. These are the Fed's
डिमांड जोन
proposed
पे
rule
बुलिश
would apply
इनगल्फिंग
to
इतनी बड़ी बना
only
दी है
37 of the nation's 4,500 banks, only the banks that have
शहरियार
$100
साहब इस एरिया से आपने क्यों नहीं
billion
बाय
or
किया ये
more
एरिया जो
in
मैं
capital.
बोल बोल
Now,
के
Chair
बोल बोल
Powell,
के
when
थक
you
गया
testified before this committee last
बहुत
June,
बढ़िया
I
नासिर भाई
asked
सर
you about
थैंक यू
taking
उस्ताद दिल
responsibility
करता
for the
है
bank
थोड़ा
failures.
मत्था चूम दिया
And you said, quote,
ओके
"The main
बबलू
responsibility
बादशाह
I take
वाह क्या नाम है यार
is to
बबलू
learn the
बादशाह
right
बहुत खुश हूँ
lessons from
आलमजेब भाई
mistakes
अब आपने राब्ता करना है
and
मुझसे
address them
ठीक है, और कोशिश करें अपनी लाट को थोड़ा कम कर दें यार, कोई नहीं, दोबारा से जो छोटा मोटा ऊपर है ना उसको दोबारा से बना लेंगे, लेकिन अपने अकाउंट को रिस्क में मत डालो प्लीज, बड़ी बड़ी लाटें मत लगाया करो, एक ही दिन में अमीर होने की ख्वाहिश खत्म करें। अच्छा सर, ये क्या लिख रहे थे उस्ताद जी? एक मिनट, सिल्वर सिल्वर का
Vice Chair for Supervision Barr's
सिल्वर में क्या हो गया?
recommendations for strengthening the Fed's rules and supervisory practices for the big banks, and that you're, quote, confident they will lead to a stronger and more resilient banking system, end quote. So I just want to be clear. You haven't backed down from any of your comments from a
मुझे
year
असल में ना
ago,
मेरा
have
गला
you, Chair
खराब है।
Powell? Right lessons, don't
हमारे
let this
एरिया
happen
के पे
again,
पहुंचे और फिर मुड़े
supporting
ना,
Vice
थोड़ा
Chair
बहुत तो मुड़े।
Barr's recommendations, which include
अच्छा,
stronger
यहाँ पे ना
banking
आप लोग
standards.
अपना बाय का
You
प्रॉफिट
still stand
थोड़ा
by
सा
all
बुक कर
that?
सकते हैं,
Good, good. I'm
ठीक है,
glad
ये
to
बात
hear
याद
that.
रखना, ऐसा नहीं कि वो
Now,
आप
I
पालते रहो और फिर नीचे आए
understand
तो
that
आपका कम
those
हो जाए, कुछ ना कुछ
37
तो बुक
big
करें,
banks
बाकी को
don't
ब्रेक इवन
like
करें
the
ना।
higher capital rules because they
अच्छा,
are
दो
like
आप
insurance.
सिल्वर का
You
पूछ
know,
रहे हैं। अच्छा,
they
एक
make
मिनट,
the
सिल्वर
bank
का मैं बड़े
safer,
टाइम
but
फ्रेम
they
पे आपको
cost a
समझाता
little
हूँ।
money and would nip into the
सिल्वर
bank's
का आपको
profits.
मैं बड़े टाइम फ्रेम
So
पे
these
बताता हूँ।
37 banks are
मेरे सिल्वर
swinging
का
a
मैंने
very
बताया था, ये देखो,
considerable weight around
जब तक
to
सिल्वर
try to weaken the capital rules.
24.1
They've
से
spent
नीचे
tens
जाके
of
क्लोजिंग
millions
नहीं
of
देता ना, तब
dollars
तक बाय है,
running
और अगर
ads
क्लोजिंग
on
देगा तो
Sunday
ब्रेकआउट
night
होगा,
football
और फिर
and
इस जगह पे
millions
जाके
more for
23.6 से बाय
armed
कीजिएगा।
lobbyists to try to twist arms here in Congress. Impressive spending, but who exactly are they
सही
trying
था,
to
0.25 लाइट
impress?
सर, ओके है सर,
And on
27
the
जी बिल्कुल
inside,
ठीक है, अच्छा है, लेकिन
despite
मर्टेंगल
all you
किया करें,
said
यानी
last year,
0.05 की
banks
5
feel
लाट्स ओपन
about
करें, ठीक
supporting
है,
Vice Chair
0.05
Barr's recommendations to
0.05 की
strengthen
5
rules
लाट।
for big banks. Public
अच्छा जी,
reporting now
21
says
साल
that
में
you
हूँ,
are
हेज कर दूं,
driving efforts
हेज
inside
से
the Fed
हेज से
to
कर,
weaken
यार
the
आपको तो
capital
फौरन हेज
rules.
करना चाहिए था।
You even told
सर
a
मैं
House
अभी
Financial
यूनिवर्सिटी से आया
Services
हूँ,
Committee
गोल्ड ट्रेड लगाऊं,
representative
अभी ना
yesterday
लगाना,
that you
अभी
think
बाय
it
नहीं
is,
लगानी, कम से
quote,
कम रुक जाओ।
very
सिल्वर कहाँ से बाय
plausible,
करें, ये
close
सिल्वर
quote,
का मैंने
that
बता
you
दिया,
withdraw
सिल्वर
your
आप लोगों ने
ruling.
अगर बाय करना
This
भी है ना तो
plan was
24
put,
से बाय
quote,
कीजिएगा,
I
ठीक
don't
है,
think they will pass a
अभी ये
final
अभी
rule
ये थोड़ा सा
without
रिजेक्ट
House
करेगा नीचे की
support,
तरफ।
suggesting that the rules
ये
will
देखा,
have to
इसको
be
मैंने बताया था ना, इस एरिया
rewritten
से जाकर रिजेक्ट
to
करेगा, यहाँ पे
include
प्रॉफिट
some
बुक कर
power.
लिया,
So,
ओके
Chair
खलास।
Powell, I'm having trouble reconciling the
नहीं
statements
यार,
you made
क्लोजिंग
last
करने
year,
लगूं,
which
नमाज का
you
टाइम हो रहा है।
said
अच्छा, बेरिश
you hold
इनगल्फिंग
on
ऑन
to.
2 एच टाइम फ्रेम पे,
Statements you made when the headlines were all
पंप
about
फॉर
three giant bank failures.
रीटेस्ट, एम आई राइट
And
सर?
now
राइट,
your
यस
reported
राइट।
efforts
अच्छा,
to
थैंक यू,
quietly
मुझे
weaken the
1000
rules
यूएसडी करना
that
है
would
सीडब्ल्यूजी में।
strengthen capital
सीडब्ल्यूजी में
standards for
1000
giant
करोगे
banks
तो
and
मुझे नहीं,
prevent more
2000
bank
के ऊपर
failures.
2000 वो दे रहे हैं, मुझे
So
आइडिया नहीं, वो पूछना
let me
पड़ेगा।
just give you a
आप
chance
राब्ता
to
कर ले, मैं
clarify
आपको
the record.
मैनेजर के
Are
साथ
you
कनेक्शन
committed
करवा दूंगा, ठीक
to
है?
finalizing the strongest
अच्छा
version
जी,
of the
अच्छा जी,
Basel
अच्छा जी,
III
अच्छा जी।
capital rules this year?
अच्छा ब्रोकर है
Let me
वो भी ना।
first say that
दूसरा ये
we
है
have
कि
taken
एक्सिम
and are
ग्लोबल
taking
अच्छा
many
ब्रोकर है।
more steps to deal with the problems that
प्रोफेसर
revealed themselves
बकरी
at
है।
Silicon Valley Bank, and that's around supervision. We'll have a strong liquidity.
I appreciate that, but I'm just asking about the Basel III rules, the ones that you have been required for years now to put in place and have dragged your feet on.
The Basel III rules are not directly related. They're not the thing that is directly related to Silicon Valley Bank. As you point out, they're a longer run thing, and I would just say that we put them out for comment. We got the comments. Anybody's free to go read the comments. My view is that it will be appropriate to make material and broad changes to that before we finalize it. And in terms of, I didn't say that
Material and broad changes to strengthen the rules?
material and broad changes, and we're talking about what that'll mean in the end. I did not say that we would withdraw the rules.
दोबारा
I
से
said, there's a
प्रेशर
concept
बना
of
के
doing
नीचे की तरफ आ
proposal,
रहा है
and I
गोल्ड।
said we hadn't made a decision on
व्हाट्सएप
that,
नंबर,
but that if that turns out to
व्हाट्सएप
be
नंबर,
appropriate in the view of the Board of Governors, then that's something we would look at doing.
So everything you said a year ago about
आप ना वो
supporting
मेरी
the vice
इसमें
chair who is
चैनल के ऊपर जाए ना
responsible
तो
for writing
पीछे
these rules?
लिखा हुआ है
You and I
नंबर।
had a long colloquy.
Yes, we did.
If you read it again, it's on your
And I
website.
have.
You will see that I'm doing
सीपी के ऊपर
exactly
ना
what
मेरी
I said I
3
would
से
do.
4 वीडियो
You
मौजूद है, प्लीज
said
आप
you
जाकर वो
would
देखो,
support
ठीक है?
Vice
प्लेलिस्ट
Chair
में चले जाएं,
Barr
लर्निंग की वीडियो में
to
होगी
get
वो।
us strong rules, and now he is putting
No,
out rules,
that
and
was
you're
about
talking
जो
Silicon
भी
about
बंदा
Valley
सीपी
Bank.
के ऊपर ट्रेड करेगा,
The Vice Chair
मैं
of
इंश्योर
Supervision
करता हूँ
has
कि उसका
every
नुकसान
right
नहीं
to
होगा।
bring
आप
proposals to the
सिर्फ
board.
इतना करें कि सीपी के बिल्कुल टाइट नीचे शुरू में सुबह सुबह जब मैं बताऊंगा सीपी के बिल्कुल पास जुड़ी होगी मार्केट, उसके बाद फिर वो आहिस्ता आहिस्ता, ये देखो आपको समझा भी देता हूँ यार, ये चेक करो, ये आज का सीपी मैंने आपको बताया 146,
You are the leader of the
ठीक
Fed.
है?
Pete was on last year. You talked
अब आप
about
थोड़ा सा
how
गौर से
tough
सुनना
on
मेरी बात।
banks, but now the giant banks
ये
are
आज का
talking
सीपी
about
था,
that, and you've got a
मार्केट ने
lead
उस वक्त
on
ये
this.
इधर
The
क्लोज
American
कर रही
people
थी
need
ट्रेड,
a
इधर
leader
मैंने आपको
at
बोला
the
था कि अभी
Fed
कोई
with the
डिसीजन ना करना।
courage to stand
ये
up to the
कैंडल नीचे
Fed's
क्लोज
lead.
कम
Dr.
अज कम
Richardson.
अगली कैंडल आपने 15 मिनट वेट करना है, यानी कि ये कौन सी कैंडल होगी? 30 मिनट की,
Chairman, thank you.
30 मिनट की
Chairman
कैंडल
Powell,
होगी,
thanks for being here. Good to see you.
ठीक है?
I
तो
can tell you
अब
from
आपने क्या
attending
करना है,
from
जो ही
continuing to see
क्लोजिंग
the
ऊपर दे दी, ये
impacts
देखो इसने
across the
क्लोज दे
board
दिया
from
50 के ऊपर,
inflation,
फिर
from
आपने
bottom-up
जहां पे भी अगली
policies of this
कैंडल होगी
administration,
आपने उसको बाय करना है, ठीक है?
colleagues across the aisle
अब
to
आपने
make
थोड़ा सा
commendable
शुरू में आपको
job
दिक्कत
well
होगी,
done
आप बेशक
trying to
शुरू में ना
rein in
पहला एक
inflation.
हफ्ता डेमो के ऊपर
Encourage
प्रैक्टिस
you
कर लें
to
और
continue
देखें
to
कि क्या
fight
एवरेज निकलती है, ठीक है?
despite
अब इसका
political
एसएल यहाँ पे
pressure
रखें
from
और हर
others.
बार बाय करते रहें, बाय करते रहें, और बाय में प्रॉफिट भी बुक करें। फिर ऐसा नहीं कि होल्ड करके रख लें एक ही
I'm
ट्रेड,
also
बार बार ट्रेड लेनी
encouraged,
होगी।
contrary perhaps
जब
to
भी
my
नीचे आए बाय
colleagues in
करें, जब भी ऊपर जब
Massachusetts,
सेल
I'm encouraged
बुक
by your
करें, फिर बाय
comments
करें, फिर बुक करें,
yesterday that there
ठीक
will
है?
be broad
लेकिन ऐसा नहीं कि
changes
ऊपर से
in
सेल करना
Basel
शुरू कर
III
दें, इसको
proposal,
सेल
which
आप इसके नीचे आए तो ही करें। बस ये सीपी ट्रेड अगर माइंड में सेट करते हैं तो आप जो है ना यूएस सेशन से ही अपना पहले अपना टारगेट पूरा कर लिया करोगे।
availability to small businesses. And lastly, I
इंडिया में
commend
कैश
you
विड्रॉ,
on the
वैसे आप लोग
suggestion
कोशिश करें कि यूएसडीटी
that the
से जो है
Fed
ना वो
is
लेन देन
not
क्लियर
a
करें।
climate agency. And
स्प्रेड उनका
considering the
डिफरेंट अकाउंट के
impact
ऊपर ना
of
डिफरेंट
climate
है, अब
change is
डिपेंड
not
करता है कि
a
आप कौन सा
factor
अकाउंट ले रहे हैं।
in achieving your given mandate,
ये
congressional
देखो,
mandate of
अगर आप
maximum
अंदाजा
leverage
करें
and
इसको
stable
इसको गौर से
prices.
देखो तो ये
Mr. Chairman, I
जो एरिया
recently
बनता है
joined
ना
many of my colleagues
जहां से
in
मार्केट
writing to you
रिजेक्ट हुई है,
about my concerns about the
ये
long-term debt
50%
proposal
का
that
एरिया है।
mandate regional
ये देखो,
banks issue new long-term debt. I'm
ये
concerned
51%
that this
रिट्रेस
will
होने के
have a
बाद मार्केट ऊपर की तरफ पुल बैक हुई है।
disproportionate impact on smaller regional banks because they're required to hold their long-term debt at
इंडिया में
both
अच्छा
the parent
अच्छा
holding
सर,
company and
करंट
insured
बाय और सेल
depository
इस
bank
वक्त तो बाय नहीं है, बहरहाल ये है कि ये
Could you
ब्रेकआउट करता है
explain
तो
how
फिर
this
बाय आप
aligns
61 तक देख
with the
सकते हो। इस एरिया से
tailoring
मार्केट रिजेक्ट हो
requirements
रही है
set
ना,
forth
रिजेक्शन हो
in the
सकती है,
financial
ठीक है? तो
reform bill that we
बाय हो चुकी है
passed
ना, इस
back
एरिया
in
से बाय हो चुकी है। अभी
2018
आप लोग
Senate
बाय
Bill
प्रॉफिट बुक करने के चक्कर में
2555.
So have a longer-term debt proposal.
यूएस आयल की 79 से सेल बनती है,
First of all, we
लेकिन
have
बहुत ही
the
छोटी
Fed's
लाट
macro
इस्तेमाल करें,
climate,
क्योंकि वो
that
किसी
one
टाइम भी ना
comments
80 का
on
एरिया
the
तोड़ेगा।
yet.
मैं
So
आपकी
I don't
मैं
want to
आपके
say too much,
एफिलिएशंस में
but
आऊँगा। जी बिल्कुल,
the
आप
theory of it would be
अलमज़ेब
first
मुझसे रब्ता
principles.
करेंगे
They're not,
तो
those banks are
आपको
not
इंशाल्लाह
subject
मैं
to
बुलाऊँगा यार। मैं आप
the
मेरा
living
नंबर
will
बेशक नोट कर
process
लें,
to the
वैसे
extent that the G-SIBs
व्हाट्सएप
are.
पे उस पे
And it's
दिया
sort
हुआ
of
है,
meant to be a
इधर मैं टाइप भी
bolster
कर
to
देता
make
हूँ
them
नंबर।
more resolvable without imposing all of the burdens that we impose on the 8 G-SIBs to have very elaborate resolution plans. So that was
ये मेरा
the
व्हाट्सएप
thinking,
नंबर
I
है।
think, on the calibration of it and all that. We have voluminous comments. We're looking at them, and we'll make an assessment and move forward as appropriate.
Well, thank you, and I know our smaller
ब्रोकर की इन्फॉर्मेशन भी इंशाल्लाह, ब्रोकर के ऊपर भी अच्छे ब्रोकर आ रहे हैं जिनके ऊपर कम स्प्रेड होगा, और हम उस पे कोशिश करेंगे कि आप लोगों को मजीद फ़ायदा हो सके, क्योंकि आधे से ज़्यादा तो हमारे पैसे ब्रोकर खा जाता है कमीशन मद में, स्वैप में और इन चीज़ों में ना। सीपी कैसे पता चलेगा सर? सुबह सवेरे उठ के मैं जो वीडियो बनाता हूँ उसमें सबसे पहले सीपी बताता हूँ। अगर आप मेरी वीडियो देखते हो तो सबसे पहले मैं सीपी ही तो बताता हूँ डेली कि आज का ये सीपी है। सीपी ट्रेड फिर से बताएं प्लीज। सीपी ट्रेड के ऊपर मेरी वीडियो मौजूद है, आप जाके देख सकते हो। प्रॉपर प्रैक्टिकली करके मैंने सिखाया हुआ है, वहां पे रिप्ले करके दिखाया हुआ है, बैक टेस्टिंग की हुई है। तो आप वो वीडियो लाजमी देखें। आप वो वीडियो देखोगे तो आपको कॉन्सेप्ट क्लियर हो जाएगा काफी सारा, ठीक है? जो इनकी हालत है ना, ये देखो पूरी रात बैठ के इधर लगे रहेंगे, फिर भी इनका डॉलर ऊपर नहीं जाना। इसकी हालत चेक करें, कहां से लगता है आपको ये इस डिमांड जोन को टच करेगा ही करेगा। ब्रेकआउट पे ब्रेकआउट कर रहा है।
would have to factor this into its decision making.
I think we're a long way from that, and that's a real that's a terrible place to be. That's a place where some poorer emerging market countries have found themselves over the years. For the United States to get to that point, I think it's unlikely. But I do think that, and it's not our business, we should stay out of this fiscal business, but I'll say what other Fed chairs have said, which is we really need to get back to that discussion about fiscal sustainability, and both sides need to get together. The kinds of things that have to happen can only be done on a bipartisan basis. And so I really hope that we go back to a place where those discussions are happening again.
I've heard from a number of stakeholders about upcoming changes to liquidity regs, including a new ultra-short-term liquidity requirement.
वैसे सीपी तो सेंटर पॉइंट
As
होता है
with
लेकिन
any
इसको टर्निंग
policy
पॉइंट भी बोलते
decision
हैं
establishing
अच्छा
the
कैसा
facts
ब्रोकर है
matters, it's
एक्स फ्लो
important that
एक्स फ्लो के
financial
बारे में यार स्टडी
regulators
करना
have
पड़ेगा
a complete,
सर यूएस बीटीसी
thorough
यूएसडी रिजेक्ट
understanding of
दिया
the
है
financial
बीटीसी यूएसडी
environment
मैंने बताया ना
before
कि
releasing
बिटकॉइन को अब
updates to
यहाँ से
reports
बाय
and
नहीं करना
reporting
ये सेलिंग
values.
जोन है इसका
My question is, what do you believe is a sufficient time period that would allow your agency to accurately calibrate new sound and reasonable liquidity requirements?
That is a great question, and one we're struggling with, particularly with all the other things that are going on. We're looking at some, and this is in response to Silicon Valley Bank, we're looking at some liquidity innovations, and we're asking ourselves, what form should that take, and how long should it be out for comment, and that sort of thing. We're not ready to do that yet, but that's the question we're asking.
Follow-on question, then I'm finished, Mr. Chairman. Will you confirm that prior to the Federal Reserve issuing any new liquidity requirements, it will first conduct all necessary data collection that would allow for meaningful analysis of all potential policy options?
And please keep your answer short, Mr. Chairman.
Maybe. No.
That's very short. Thank you.
इसके ब्रेकआउट का वेट करें या इसके ब्रेकआउट का वेट करें इस एरिया में बाय तभी करना जब इससे ब्रेकआउट हो जाए या फिर यहाँ से इस जगह से बाय करना ये बाय के दो ही जगह सेलिंग का ये एरिया यहाँ से भी सेल कर सकते हो और ब्रेकआउट के रिटर्न करने के बाद यहाँ पे भी सेल कर सकते हो बीटीसी वैसे मैं बीटीसी के जो है ना सेल के हक में नहीं हूँ इसको अगर नीचे आता भी है तो रिट्रेस करके बाय ही करें
Although if Senator Warnock sits down in the next 5 seconds, he's next. So Senator Warnock, are you ready or you want to go to War Fund? You're all so generous with each other. Senator Fetterman's recognized.
अच्छा सर फोनिक्स एफएक्स ब्रोकर अच्छा रहेगा सर
All right.
नहीं यार
Recognized from Georgia.
इतना कोई कॉमन नहीं है ब्रोकरों से बचो भाई
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Bank spending on
थैंक यू वेरी मच
buybacks
मिस्टर
is
चेयरमैन
rising
हमारी
again,
जान छोड़ यार
and their consumer small has sharply increased.
कुछ ब्रोकर हैं जो अच्छा काम करते हैं मतलब ब्रोकरों का तो काम ही बैठ खाने के लिए है ना लेकिन जिनके साथ ना वो कोऑर्डिनेशन हो ना वो फिर नहीं खाते
Bank accounts. Not a lot of money in Wall Street accounts remains.
1H में बेरिश इनगल्फिंग है वो पहले ही बनी हुई थी बिल्कुल मुझे पता है
Chairman Powell, I'm concerned that when banks don't increase the interest rates on bank
अच्छा
accounts,
डे वन की स्टोरी देखें मैंने आपको पहले बताया था कि 1 2 3 4 5 6 7वां दिन है मार्केट बुलिश हो रही है और हर दफा अपना हाई मारी है और हर दफा वीक हाई छोड़ रही है
is that good for the economy?
मैंने सुबह ही बताया था रेडी टू ऑल टाइम हाई ये सुबह कई चीजें लगी हुई है ठीक है अगर मार्केट 2050 से नीचे रिजेक्ट हो गई तो नेक्स्ट इसका लेवल जो होगा ना वो 41 एरिया 41 से रिजेक्ट हुई तो नेक्स्ट फिर इस जोन में मार्केट आ सकती है 20 और 2110 के रेंज
It is worth taking a look at. Many lower income individuals and families, again, they don't have some of the sophisticated products yet. Money markets are.
और अगर ये कैंडल्स 14 मिनट है और अगर ये कैंडल 57 के ऊपर तो फिर बुलिश बन जाएगी अब ये देखो बेरिश ने इतना नीचे स्पाइक दिया ना
benefit from. Could those individuals and families benefit from a high interest rate on their deposits?
Sure. And, it's for a long time, we had a lot of mail from people at the Fed, to the Fed saying, you should raise interest rates because we're not getting anything on our checking account.
3 दफा मार्केट मौका दे चुकी है इस एरिया से बाय करने का फैजल हसन साहब
But given the reality of the question,
चलें
so
जी
let me the monetary policy report states that while demand for housing has fallen, a strong labor market has kept prices high. That matches what I've been seeing in Georgia. Too many folks can't afford a home. According to the monetary policy report, mortgage rates were averaging around 7% last month. That's tough for lower income home buyers. Increases of just a percentage point or two can be the difference between owning a home or not. Are you concerned about this interplay between lower demand yet stubbornly high prices and what it means for folks trying to buy a home? And what do you think is driving these high prices?
So the housing market in a very challenging situation right now. You have this longer run housing shortage.
48
but
एरिया
at
से
the
बाय
same
कर सकते
time,
हैं जी,
you've got a
48
bunch of
के
things
एरिया से
that
अगर
have to do with
रिजेक्शन
the
मिली तो कर
pandemic
सकते
and
हैं.
the inflation and our response with higher rates. So you have a shortage of homes available for sale because many people
अब
are
यहाँ से
living in
टेक
homes with
प्रॉफिट
very
किया
low
तो
rate
इस एरिया पे
mortgages
आए.
and they can't afford to refinance, so they're not moving, which means the supply of
चले यार, ये तो खत्म नहीं
regular
होता, हमारा नमाज का
existing
टाइम
homes
निकल
that are
रहा है.
for sale is
चलो
historic
इंशाल्लाह
of very low transaction
मिलते
value.
हैं
That
नेक्स्ट वीडियो
actually
में.
pushes up
कल वीडियो
prices
आपको
of
बनाऊंगा आपके लिए, और कल
newer
मैं
existing homes and
कल
also
की जो
older
लाइव होगी वो
homes
बहुत ही
because there's
इंपॉर्टेंट
so
होगी.
much
सारे
supply.
पेयर्स की जो है ना हम
Builders are busy,
इंशाल्लाह
but
वो
they're
करके
running
रखेंगे.
into
अगर
some
मार्केट आपको इस
all
दफ़ा
kinds of supply
48
issues
के
still
एरिया पे
around
आके रिजेक्शन
zoning
देती है,
and
यानी
working with banks
M15
and
या
banks
M5 के ऊपर भी बुलिश
because
इनगल्फिंग देती है,
it's
तो
quite
बाय अटेम्प्ट
challenging.
करना,
And of
ठीक है,
course, rates are
अदरवाइज नहीं
high,
करना.
so people who are buying, a lot of the
क्योंकि इनकी जब
buyers
स्पीच खत्म
are
होगी तो
cash
मार्केट ने फिर
buyers
उदम
and
मचाना
they're
है.
able to actually
ठीक हो गया. काइंडली एक्सनेस ग्लोबल ब्रोकर के बारे में बता दें. एक्सनेस ग्लोबल ब्रोकर बहुत ही ज़बरदस्त है, मैं उसके ऊपर 10 साल से काम कर रहा हूँ. जीबीबी जेपीवाई का बता दिया जी, उसका टीपी मैंने आपको बता दिया था. और मार्केट इस टाइम जो है ना वो किधर पहुंची हुई है उसके, ये देखो. टीपी हो गया ना, नहीं हुआ अभी, बस थोड़ा सा फर्क रह गया यार इसके ऊपर. 189.5 टीपी है इसका, ठीक है. चलें जी, ओके हो गया. बीटीसी का भी मैं बता दिया, गोल्ड का भी मैंने बता दिया है. बाकी ओवरऑल कोई चीज़ पूछनी है फिर इंशाल्लाह सिल्वर का सेल कर सकते हैं. सिल्वर अभी सेल नहीं करना, नीचे आए तो बाय करना, ठीक है. अच्छा, ओके हो गया जी, अपना ख्याल रखिएगा बहुत सारा.